And welcome to this edition of Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Good morning, Ray. How are you?
I'm good, Keith. How are you today?
I'm good. We've got a special guest that you have arranged for us for this time. Why don't you introduce him?
All right, I'll be glad to. Todd and I go back a ways. I don't remember, Todd, exactly how we met, but we've been on the internet together for at least a few years, and he's been working all that time on the history of the German atomic bomb. Now, if you know our history about the Manhattan Project, you realize that one of the primary reasons we even had the Manhattan Project is because we were convinced, we along with others, Great Britain as well, convinced that Germany was going to build an atomic bomb. And Leo Szilard went to Albert Einstein because of his name recognition and wrote a letter that was sent to President Roosevelt, actually went to him through Alexander Sachs. And this is in '39. And the idea was, in that letter, it stated that they was afraid Germany was trying to build a bomb out of uranium. So that led to the Manhattan Project. Now, what's interesting about what Todd's done is he's gone way beyond just what were the early indicators. He does that. He does talk about what they were doing during the World War II, but he also points out that these German scientists formed the basis of a lot, I mean a whole lot, of what we take for granted today as technological achievements. So I think you're going to enjoy his presentation about Germany and their scientists, and start off, Todd, by talking about the German atomic bomb. And anything else you'd like to say about yourself, please go ahead and do that. My introduction is surely not complete with your background. So if you want to add something, please do.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you both for inviting me on the show. I really appreciate it. I'm a scientist, and over the last 77 years, many books and articles have been written about the World War II German nuclear program. But almost all of those have been from historians and journalists, and really not from scientists. I really wanted to analyze it from a scientific perspective, and especially analyze a lot of documents that have been found in archives over the last couple of decades, much more recently than most of those history books. So what I'm going to show you would not have been possible without the help of a whole lot of archives all around the world, and a whole lot of people, including Ray here. And also what I'm going to show is only a subset of material that is available for free from my website. So there are more slides and all these archival documents, a whole lot more information that you can download from my website if you're curious. So the conventional historical view of the wartime German nuclear program was that it was very small and that it really didn't get very far. And that was based on a very limited amount of data. In particular, the US had an ALSOS mission that went into Europe, went into Germany at the end of the war. And they found Werner Heisenberg's fission pile, an incomplete reactor at Haigerloch, and they really didn't find too much else. On the other hand, looking now at the ALSOS documents and archives, you can see that there were all kinds of organizations that we know now were involved in the German nuclear program, and all kinds of scientists, and all kinds of locations that ALSOS never even investigated. So they barely even looked at the German nuclear program, and therefore it's not surprising that they found very little information about the German nuclear program. The conventional historical view is also based strongly on the Farm Hall transcripts. So as you guys know, after the war, 10 German nuclear scientists were imprisoned for 6 months in Great Britain at Farm Hall, and their conversations were secretly recorded, and those transcripts have now been published. People place a lot of weight in the fact that those scientists didn't really blab and reveal a whole lot. On the other hand, that was only 10 scientists, and most of the major German nuclear scientists were not present at Farm Hall. Also, the transcripts that we have are only a very small amount of what these guys would have said over the course of 6 months. And at one point in the transcripts, they actually reveal that they seem to know that they're being recorded. And so presumably they would have conducted their conversations accordingly. So the conventional view of the German program is based on this very small amount of data. And so I wanted to take a fresh look at the program. And when you do, you find that the German program was much larger and began much earlier than people have believed. In fact, as early as the 1920s, German scientists began working on nuclear fusion. And then in 1934, a German scientist, Hidetaka Nodak, published theoretical predictions that uranium fission was possible and that plutonium production was possible. 1934. In that same year, possibly inspired by that, Erich Schumann, who was an implosion expert, hired Kurt Diebner, who was a nuclear expert, to work on a secret German army weapons project. And so the fact that here you have implosion and nuclear stuff together for a secret army weapons project seems to indicate the lines along which they were thinking. This work continued through the 1930s. And then by 1938, Hartmut Kalman and Ernst Kuhn had patented high voltage fusion neutron generators and tritium breeders. Germany began mining for uranium in Bulgaria and also in Czech uranium mines that they took over in 1938. And then by the end of 1938, Hahn and Strassmann had officially demonstrated that nuclear fission was possible. Then 1939, after that, was a very big year. Paul Hartek and Wilhelm Groth in Hamburg proposed to the German government that it was possible to construct a fission bomb. And then for the next several years over the course of the war, they worked on many different aspects of that. Another German scientist, Siegfried Pflüger, in 1939 also published papers with detailed calculations of both fission reactors and fission bombs. And he appears to have become the head theoretical physicist of the German nuclear program after that. That same year, Georg Stetter in Austria filed a detailed patent on fission reactors and on fusion, and proceeded to lead a very large Austrian research group throughout the war. Wilhelm Ohnesorge and Manfred von Ardenne at the Reichspost, the German post office, kind of their equivalent of AT&T Bell Labs, launched a program to enrich uranium and to build a fission bomb. Still in 1939, Germany began ordering and making heavy water for fission reactors. And in 1940, or possibly even sooner, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Fritz Hautermans, and others proposed and calculated the suitability of plutonium-239 for bombs. So the German nuclear program was quite large, much larger than historians have believed. People generally talk about Werner Heisenberg and the group of people around him. Those were just one small part of a much, much larger program, many different groups across many different organizations, government agencies, companies, and these were not independent groups. So each one was working on different things, but they were all coordinated, apparently at the top, first by the German army up until 1942. And then from 1942 onward, apparently they were coordinated by the SS. And these research groups, these nuclear production sites were spread all over German territory. So here's a map of known and suspected nuclear research and production sites that I've compiled based on archival documents. They're all over the place. So it was not just Heisenberg and his buddies in a basement in Berlin. It was a massive, massive program, truly comparable to the Manhattan Project in the United States. Germany also obtained a lot of uranium and a lot of thorium, which could be used to make uranium-233, which is fissionable. And so either they had a large nuclear weapons program, or else they were simply trying to power their DeLorean, but they were up to something. So between 1938 and 1945, Germany obtained over 1,500 tons of uranium ore and over 1,300 tons of thorium ore from at least 10 different sites all over Europe everywhere from Portugal to Bulgaria and in between. They had uranium mines all over the place. Here are a couple of quotes from US intelligence documents after the war saying that the Germans put uranium mining on a high priority throughout the entire 6 years of the war. And in fact, it was such a high priority that they didn't ship the uranium ore from the mines to their destination by truck or by train. They flew it. They wanted the uranium ore to get to the destination as rapidly as possible. So there were special planes, and the uranium ore was flown to multiple destinations in Germany and Austria where they were processing the uranium. The intelligence source also says that the Germans continued mining uranium up to the very last moment of the war. So it truly was a high priority. Here's another quote from 1943. An intelligence source says that in Bulgaria, where the Germans had been mining uranium since 1938, that was done under the organization TOT, which was the German equivalent of the US Army Corps of Engineers. And an engineer there accidentally slipped up and revealed that they planned to use that to create an incendiary weapon that would destroy London. Then the uranium was taken to many different sites, again, all over German territory. This shows some of the main sites that are known from archival documents, but all over the place. And at these sites, it was processed into refined uranium oxide, into uranium hexafluoride, and into uranium metal, and then used for further processes. It was used, among other things, for enrichment. So to enrich uranium, Manfred von Ardenne and other scientists developed electromagnetic separators that were quite comparable to the Oak Ridge Y12 calutrons. And they demonstrated fully functional prototypes of these. Separately, Gustav Hertz had invented gaseous diffusion enrichment, actually as early as 1923. So from 1925, here is a diagram from Hertz of a cascade of gaseous diffusion enrichment. And even though Hertz was Jewish, he was allowed to remain and work in Germany throughout the war. So he was doing something very high priority that the German government appreciated. And then after the war, he went over to the Soviet Union and helped in the Soviet nuclear weapons program. And so this gaseous diffusion would have been quite comparable to, say, K-25 at Oak Ridge. Then there were centrifuges. The US did not get very far with uranium gaseous centrifuges during the war, but the Germans did. So there were multiple groups in Germany that developed and perfected uranium gas centrifuges. Many of their reports survive and are currently in the archives of the Deutsches Museum in Munich. And they developed not only prototypes of these centrifuges, but they mass produced them. Here is an archival document from the files of Vannevar Bush. And this document indicates that as of early 1944, US intelligence knew that there was a whole factory in Switzerland, of all places, that was mass producing German gas uranium centrifuges based on German specifications, and then shipping them to unknown destinations in Germany. So gas centrifuges were being mass produced in Switzerland. Also, we know from other archival documents in Breslau, in Göttingen, in Freiburg, in Kiel, and possibly other locations as well. Then these methods of enriching uranium were installed at locations. We have archival documents indicating some of those. One of those locations appears to have been south of Hamburg, an area called Lüneburger Heide. So here is an OSS document from 1943 that talks about vast underground factories putting out a new explosive for bombs. And they say that the bombs have a strange design. The bombs are designed to be spherical. Now, bombs are usually designed to be aerodynamic, which is not spherical. If the bomb must be spherical, then there's some physics that compels that, which suggests a Fat Man type implosion bomb. Here's a different OSS report from 1943 about the same location. It says that these underground bomb-proof factories are employing large numbers of people and making a high density material that is supposed to have an enormous explosive effect. With 1 kilogram of the material, everything should be razed away or disintegrated to dust and ashes within a radius of approximately 4 kilometers. Here's a different document from 1944 talking about 2 other factories. These are in Eastern Czech territory controlled by the Germans. And it says that there were 2 factories, they were identical. Each one employed 30,000 employees, so very large factories. And they were producing a new explosive for what OSS called a Zusa. A Zusa was the OSS code word for the German nuclear program. So they were producing an explosive for the German nuclear program at two factories that collectively employed 60,000 people. These factories would have been removed by Soviet forces at the end of the war, so we don't have further Allied reports on these. So in addition to enriching uranium, apparently Germany was also working on breeding plutonium. Everybody always hears about Heisenberg's reactor, which started at Berlin-Dahlem and then was moved to Haigerloch toward the end of the war. But you don't really hear about all these other German nuclear reactors. And some of these were small experimental piles, not unlike Chicago Pile 1 that Fermi assembled in the United States. But some of these sound very much like they were large production reactors, comparable to, say, Hanford. So one at Gusen that sounds like that, one at Königsberg that sounds like that. Some of these others may have been as well. And as an example, this is the nuclear physicist Kurt Diebner and his colleagues outside their experimental fission pile early. This is in 1941. And you can see that clearly they are not playing around. They're quite serious about what they're doing with their fission pile. So by the end of the war, there's evidence that there were actually large production reactors, again, comparable to Hanford. Here is a site at Gusen, Austria. These are aerial photos taken by the United States in late in the war, 1945. And this appears to be a reactor complex that is mostly underground. Here you can see it exposed. And then a month later, shortly before US forces arrived, German forces completely buried and sealed up this entire complex. And it has remained sealed to this day. And officially, this complex does not exist. This is not on any maps. But unofficially here, you can see the photos of it. Here is the son of the commandant of the Gusen camp. He was interviewed on camera, and he said that he knew, based on his father's experience as commandant of the camp, that nuclear research was being carried out at Gusen, and that according to the SS people there, it would enable the production of the atomic bomb. Here is a document I found in US Air Force archives. This is a cover letter describing this and other Austrian facilities, and somebody very prominently labeled it underground pile. Now, unfortunately, I only have the cover letter for this. The report that goes with this cover letter is mysteriously unavailable. Then there's production of heavy water. So everybody always hears about heavy water production at the plant in Femork, Norway, and how that was very heroically destroyed by Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris and saved the war. But you don't hear about the other 19 or so heavy water plants all over Europe. So there were at least 20 plants all over Europe apparently producing heavy water for the German nuclear program, despite the fact that wartime production was urgently needed in other areas. So why this high priority? It strongly suggests that heavy water was needed for breeder reactors, that there were indeed functional breeder reactors someplace, or possibly that it was needed for electronuclear breeding, a different way of making plutonium, or for fusion fuel or other purposes. Moreover, why is it that almost all the reports about all these heavy water plants are still classified and unavailable? So here from US archives, withdrawal notice, access restricted, withdrawal notice, access restricted, withdrawal notice, access restricted, access restricted, access restricted. If there was no German nuclear program, why do these reports exist? And why are they still classified after 77 years? In addition to fission fuel and heavy water, Germany was also producing large quantities of other nuclear materials, including lithium, beryllium, boron, graphite, fluorine, aluminum, calcium, nickel, zirconium, and cadmium. They were producing these in quantities up to thousands of tons during the war. And in fact, there were some sites that were producing many of these materials all at the same site. For example, IG Farben's Bitterfeld facility was producing heavy water and graphite and aluminum and calcium and possibly other things as well. And by golly, sure, that's not mysterious at all. In addition to that, in addition to being used in Germany, many of these materials were exported to Japan. We have lists of materials on U-boats that were sent to Japan, and many of these nuclear-related materials were sent to Japan. So not only did Germany produce these materials, they knew what to do with them. These are diagrams from Erich Schumann, who had been working, as I said, since 1934 on nuclear weapons. So these diagrams from Schumann show a spherical implosion bomb with a weight of 2 tons. It used fission fuel, probably uranium-235, possibly plutonium. And Schumann showed that in the center, there would also be fusion fuel that would give a boost to the explosive yield. Schumann showed in his diagrams in detail how the fusion and fission fuel would be surrounded by conventional explosives. Those would be both TNT and RDX explosives shaped into explosive lenses. So extremely, very much like the Fat Man design in the United States. Schumann also showed how the implosion process would work, that the implosion would be activated by detonators at many points surrounding the explosives, and then it would implode the pit in the center of the bomb. So they knew how to design a bomb. Did they build it? Here is a document that Rainer Karlsch, a German historian, found in an archive in Moscow in 2003. This document is quite shocking, but it appears to be genuine. It's part of a long paper trail of earlier and later documents, including documents that have been published elsewhere. This is a letter from March 1945 from Soviet General Ilyichev to Stalin. And this letter says in great detail, the Germans have in recent times, meaning March 45, carried out 2 large capacity bomb explosions in Thuringia. The bomb, filled with uranium-235 and weighing approximately 2 tons, was brought to the test site. Buildings and fortifications specially constructed for the test were destroyed in the explosion. Prisoners of war who were near the epicenter of the explosion died, often without leaving a trace. And a massive radioactive effect was observed. And this Soviet intelligence report from March 45, from during the war, gives a detailed design of the bomb that agrees extremely well with Erich Schumann's design. So it says the bomb was 2 tons. It was a spherical implosion bomb. It used uranium-235. It had fusion fuel at the center. It gives the details of the bomb design really quite at length. And it says that the bomb was specifically designed to be mounted on a rocket of the V type, so a V2 or more advanced type of rocket. And describes the implosion, that a shock from the explosion of the TNT was directed toward the center, allowing the uranium to reach a critical mass. So it describes all this in detail, how the bomb worked, that the bomb was built, the bomb was tested. We have a number of other sources from archives that also describe the same bomb design, and all these independent sources describe exactly the same implosion design. We also have a number of other sources that all describe exactly that same test in March 1945 in Thuringia. So there's considerable evidence that this occurred. Now that raises the question, could you detect the results at the test site now? A lot of people say, well, yes, of course you grab a Geiger counter, you go wandering around, you find where they tested this thing. Those are people who learned their nuclear physics from watching Planet of the Apes. Now, if you learn your nuclear physics from the actual source books, you can do the calculations. So Glasstone and Dolan is the standard reference book on this stuff. And according to that, 77 years later, where we are now, the radioactivity at the test site would be almost 1 billion times lower than it was an hour after the test. And if you do the math, that corresponds to the current expected radioactivity at the test site being 10 to 30 times smaller than the normal natural background level of radiation. So you could not detect this by wandering around with a Geiger counter. Now, if somebody has a whole lot of money and is willing to do a whole lot of testing and digging, it may be possible to detect things at the test site. In particular, if there was a very large natural uranium tamper in this bomb, there may be enough residue from that that could be detected, but this would be a large program. So the Germans appear to have had a nuclear weapon. The Germans certainly thought that they had a nuclear weapons program. Here is an archival photograph of Mr. Mustache himself, apparently surrounded by lots of nuclear physicists. This looks like Kurt Diebner. This looks like Werner Heisenberg. This looks like Fritz Strassmann. This looks like Rolf Wiederow. And this photograph was taken in April 1943, so over 2 years before the end of the war. And this photograph was taken in Austria, very close to Gusen, very close to that possible fission reactor that I showed you guys earlier. So if Germany had a nuclear weapon, why did they not use it in the war? Here is a formerly secret cable from Allen Dulles, who later became head of the CIA. So in April 45, he sent this cable to Washington saying that the Fuhrer is surrounded by a small group of advisors who believe in a last specific secret weapon, which they call the desperation weapon. But the generals believe that this weapon could not decide the war. It would only cause a terrible bloodbath. And so the generals are refusing to use the weapon, even if Hitler ordered them to. So it appears that Germany did indeed have nuclear weapons, but the German generals were smart enough to realize that even if they could vaporize 1 or 2 Allied targets, that would not be enough to win the war. It would simply make the Allies even madder, and Germany would still lose and face even greater repercussions. There's a lot of evidence also from the Allied side. So from December 1944, here is the diary of FDR's secretary. She says that FDR had just been informed by a reliable source that the Germans have a bomb that will kill everything within a mile, and that the German program to develop that bomb is, quote, way ahead of us. So ahead of the Manhattan Project as known by FDR and his advisors. Here's a document that I found at the National Archives. This was also from December 1944. It says intelligence indicates that the enemy is working in the project field, meaning nuclear weapons, and they have evidence that the enemy has succeeded in producing this and has a project on utilization of how to actually use the bomb against enemy targets. It presents the evidence for this, the intelligence evidence that had been collected in an appendix called Tab A. So this document is present in National Archives, but when I went to find Tab A, there's only a yellow card that says, in the review of this file, this item was removed because access to it is restricted after 77 years. So if there was no German nuclear program, why is all this information in the archives still being withheld? Here was a Newsweek report from 1945, just after the end of the war, and it said, since the surrender of the Nazi armies, Allied officers, blabbing to Newsweek reporters, have revealed that Germany would have been able to strike with atomic bombs by January 1945. The highest Allied officials, so it was high Allied officials talking to Newsweek reporters, knew that such explosives could have won the war for the Axis. And then here's a report from General Marshall, September 45, again after the war, saying German technological advances, such as the development of atomic explosives, made it imperative that we attack before these terrible weapons could be turned against us. So Marshall was admitting that these existed as well. We know that Western Allied forces visited most of the major nuclear sites I showed you. The eastern sites were all seized by Soviet forces, and goodness knows what happened to those sites. But Western sites were visited by very high profile people. We have the photos of people visiting places like Lüneburger Heide, I mentioned earlier, Ohrdruf, where one of the tests is believed to have occurred, Pilsen, Gusen that I mentioned. We have photographs of smiling people visiting these places, but we don't have the reports. And naturally, they would have written reports about what they found at these places, what they brought back from these places. But these reports are nowhere to be found in archives. So where are these reports? Why are these reports still being withheld 77 years later? We also have information from people who had worked on these programs and then were interrogated or actually came to the US or UK after the war. As I said, the top theoretical physicist in the German nuclear weapons program appears to have been Siegfried Flügge. And here is a letter from Edward Teller in the United States in 1947, urgently requesting that Siegfried Flügge be brought to the United States to help Edward Teller with a program of great national importance, probably the hydrogen bomb. And indeed, Flügge was put on a plane and brought to the US, along with a lot of other German and Austrian scientists who appear to have worked on fission and fusion weapons in Germany during the war. The top SS general in charge of the German nuclear weapons program by the end was Hans Kammler. And according to official history books, he died in early May 1945 at the end of the war. But here is a document I found in US archives from November 45, 6 months later, saying that Kammler is in custody and is being interrogated and is singing like a canary. So sprightly for a dead guy. So we know that these dozens of people from the German nuclear program were interrogated and in fact even worked in the United States and UK after the war. So the question is, where are the interrogation transcripts from all of that? Where are the reports from all of that? We know that those must exist, and yet those are not to be found in archives. Other information from archives, this is from September 45 after the war, and it's talking about a Zuse, which again was the OSS code word for the German nuclear weapons program. It says that post-war they'd realized that a Zuse was so serious that the US had appointed a special general, who they were not naming here, his name was so secret, but they'd appointed a special general. Everything was supposed to go through the special general. They were urgently trying to locate all German scientists associated with a Zuse, and they required maximum security with fewest number of persons involved. They didn't want information about a Zuse to get out to the US public. Copies of all reports had to be sent directly to Washington, nobody else. This subject's so tight at this time, we are playing very close with Special General. So who was the Special General and where are these reports? Here are index cards from the National Archives showing that somewhere in US archives, there are reports that were classified as Germany, nuclear physics, blueprints of atomic bomb, Germany, nuclear physics, atomic bomb detonating plans. Where are these reports? Here was something published after the war by Colonel George Bryant Woods. During the war, he was in intelligence for the Air Technical Services Command. And after the war, he became assistant to the Undersecretary of the Air Force. So in 1946, he wrote that Germany's plans for the A9, an advanced V2 type rocket with the atomic bomb, it is well known, at least to intelligence officials like Woods, that the Germans originally had hoped to have their atomic bomb developments completed by the end of 1944. So to sum up, the evidence that is currently available, I believe proves that the wartime German nuclear program was much larger than most historians have believed, that it was much more advanced than historians have believed, and that scientists, materials, and information from that program aided nuclear programs in the US, Soviet Union, and other countries after the war. In my opinion, the existing evidence also strongly suggests, but does not yet conclusively prove, that Germany successfully tested one or more fission bombs at the end of the war. So I think much more research needs to be done in this area. History is not settled at all. I would strongly recommend anybody who's interested to go digging in the archives all around the world, as well as personal collections of families of former soldiers and former scientists, and to lobby to have all relevant files declassified and released. Since we also know a number of sites that appear to have been locations for production or testing of these weapons, it'd be very important to conduct industrial archaeology digs at those sites and laboratory analysis of samples from those sites and try to confirm some of this. So if people are interested, there's a whole lot more information you can download for free from my website. This book, Forgotten Creators, has over 1,000 pages of these archival documents I found from all around the world on the German nuclear program. And as Ray mentioned early on, also a lot of information on other aspects of the history of science in Germany. So you guys have any questions?
Wow, that's amazing. That's information that I have, most of it I've never heard before.
Thank you.
That was something.
Thank you.
Keith, I'm not surprised. I have been following what Todd has been doing for as best I can for, and this didn't just start recently. He's been working on this a long time.
Yeah, obviously.
And this document, how many pages is it, Todd?
Well, this book is Forgotten Creators. It's currently over 4,800 pages. It's available for free from my website. And it covers the German nuclear program, but also many other aspects of the history of science and technology in Germany. But related to the German nuclear program in particular, there's over 1,000 pages in the book that has all these archival documents, text and photographs that I found in various archives around the world. And so it describes the nuclear program and also describes the methods of delivery, the rockets and things that Germany was developing to deliver these weapons.
Well, Keith, I think you'll agree with me that we have so much potential here that we should go ahead and get Todd to agree that we will bring him back, and possibly even back on May the 21st. Now, Todd, I believe you have some classes in the morning, so we'll work with you on your schedule, but we do want you to come back.
Yeah,
wouldn't you, Keith?
Absolutely, I completely agree.
Okay. And Todd, we'll work with you on the time to do the recording, but it'll be, again, Keith's got a program next time, and then we'll schedule you for the one following up in the 21st of May, or any other time that you want to do it. But you do have so much. I have one question for you. You mentioned briefly that there was German submarines, I believe you said that, and they were called U-boats, I think, that were taking materials to Japan.
Yes.
There is a book by Carter Heydrich, The Critical Mass, that talks about the submarine U-234 and the fact that it was headed to Japan. But the captain, at the end of the war, the captain decided to surrender to the Allies. Do you have information on that particular boat?
Yes, Heydrich was one of the very early people to start investigating the German nuclear program. So he was really a trailblazer there. Right. And he discovered that there was a lot of mysterious stuff about this German U-boat U-234 that, as you say, was transporting nuclear materials from Germany to Japan at the end of the war, never made it to Japan, ended up in the United States. Right. So Heydrich found that the trail basically goes cold. The U-boat was brought into port in the United States. Large quantities of uranium and other materials were unloaded from the U-boat, and then they simply vanish in the historical records. And I followed his trail in the National Archives, and indeed the trail does go cold. So definitely all this stuff came into the US. There was really great nuclear material, other information, experts on this U-boat. And then just they vanish into thin air. Neither Heydrich nor I can find out what happened to them. So it is a great mystery. But
yes, I agree.
what Hyder did not point out is that that was only one of several U-boats. I found a document indicating that at least 10 U-boats, including that one, were dispatched from Germany to Japan at the end of the war, carrying top secret critical materials. And that's at the end of the war. There were other U-boats and transports that went before that. So there was a whole lot of stuff that was either sent to Japan or they tried to send to Japan. And that included many of these nuclear materials. It included uranium oxide, possibly enriched. It included lithium, zirconium, all kinds of nuclear-related materials.
A comment about that. Carter and I have talked, and he's actually been to Oak Ridge. I took him on a tour through Y12 for him to actually see those calutrons. And he and I agreed that he did find some evidence that possibly Robert Oppenheimer was up in Virginia at the same time that U-boat was brought in. And if in fact that happened, as we assume something happened with that uranium, my contention is that it came to Oak Ridge, went through our calutrons, and went back to Japan in a little different form than Germany intended.
Yes, Oak Ridge certainly would have been the logical destination for that uranium. The question is how enriched, or was the uranium enriched before it came to Oak Ridge? And neither Heydrich nor I can really answer that question. So hopefully somebody can find the answer to that in the future.
Yeah, that would be good to know. And I'm like you, I'm at a loss as to where we might best go to find that kind of detail. One other thought, this is not within the scope of what you talked to us about, but I'll just ask you just to know, the Japanese may well have been working on a nuclear program as well. Have you done any research in that, or have you concentrated all your energies on Germany?
I have focused on Germany. I've talked to other people who have studied the Japanese program. There's a researcher named Dwight Ryder, no relation at all, but interesting coincidence. And then Robert Wilcox has written a book, and several folks have investigated that, William Pellis and others. And there is considerable evidence that also the German program was, or the Japanese program was much larger and much more advanced than historians have believed. Now, currently, the state of knowledge about that program, documents from the archives, are not as good as what we've been able to find on the German program. So we don't really know just how far the Japanese got. But I do think it's safe to say that the Japanese had a much larger and more advanced program than people have allowed in history books.
I would agree. What I found indicates that there may even have been an explosion. And but again, there's sparse documentation of that, and some of it is oral history, and some of it is just speculation on the parts of people who think about what logically could have happened had they had the progress that they knew about. Of course, we do have records of what they found in Tokyo after the war and those sorts of things. But as with the German program, it's very sketchy and hard to pin down the details. But I think what you've done on the German program is just outstanding. This information, Keith's not the only person who will say after viewing this program today, wow, I've never heard of that before. So I'm so glad that you agreed to come on and share that with us.
Oh, thank you.
Keith, you have any other thoughts?
No, I appreciate it and look forward to another presentation from you in the not too distant future, Todd. We really appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, Keith, tell us a little about what you're going to do next time.
Yeah, next time you're not going to be with us, Ray. You're going to be on an adventure. So you asked me if I might do a program, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Secret City Film Festival, which it is currently known as the Knoxville Film Festival. This is something that I started 19 years ago in Oak Ridge. And I'll talk a little bit about how about its history, about why I started a film festival in Oak Ridge, why it was called the Secret City Film Festival, and kind of some of the things that we've done and the progress that we've made over the last 19 years or so. I am right now in the middle of preparing for our festival, which will be held in September. And just a little bit about some of the things that go into putting a film festival together, and maybe a few stories of some folks that have come to the festival throughout the years and maybe gone on and do some important things. As a matter of fact, I will tell a story about a couple of guys who came to the festival when it was the Secret City Festival in Oak Ridge. And they are now one of the top 10 money makers on the internet. So I'm not going to say who it is. I'll tease that a little bit, but I'll tell their story. And I think I read a couple of weeks ago that their organization brought in $30 million last year from being internet celebrities. So anyway, that's what I plan, and I may have a guest or two that can talk. Some filmmakers that have participated over the years. So that's what we'll plan on doing next time.
Well, it does sound like you're going to bring some hidden history out. And Todd, again, we can't tell you how much we appreciate having you with us today, and look forward to other opportunities for you to share more information with us. And let me remind you viewers to notice where that website is, riderinstitute.org/revolutionary-innovation, and that will get you to this free document, this book that you can download. And also, Todd, I believe the slides that you use today are also on your website. Is that correct?
Yes, the slides are also there, and deleted scenes as well.
Okay.
All right. Very good.
Excellent. All right. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you, Todd. And thank you, Ray. Mm-hmm. And folks, thanks for watching. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new Hidden History. And welcome to this edition of Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. And Ray, you're just back from a big trip. Why don't you give us, in a nutshell, your experience?
Oh, I'd be glad to, Keith. I have. I've enjoyed a trip on the Mississippi River. I actually took the City of New Orleans train from Memphis down to New Orleans. A day of very relaxing travel, I might add. I'd never been on Amtrak before, but it worked out fine. And then I spent a day in the World War II Museum. Wow, was that really an amazing opportunity. And I talked with them about possibly exchanging traveling exhibits with Oak Ridge. By the way, they have a good display on the Manhattan Project. I was actually surprised to find how well it is done. But that's a huge museum and really doing well. Then I caught the American Heritage riverboat and went back up the Mississippi. It had a Civil War theme, so we stopped at Vicksburg, Baton Rouge, and Natchez, and talked all about, or they gave excursions out to the battlegrounds and talked about that. And actually, Keith, the highlight of the trip for me was there was one day where we didn't have any excursions. We were just cruising up the river. And the person who was in charge of the tour learned that I was a historian for the city of Oak Ridge, and she asked me to make a presentation 3 o'clock in the afternoon, gave me an hour. And as you know, I carry a thumb drive with me all the time. Todd, you understand that. So I gave the presentation that I normally give to people about the history of Oak Ridge, and we had the lounge was full of travelers, and as you know, not many of them can know much about Oak Ridge except they attach it to the atomic bomb, and that's about it. So we had a good question and answer session, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I recommend the American river cruises to anyone that's interested in, especially the history themes that go along these rivers. And the Mississippi River is it's a big river.
Yeah.
But I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thanks for asking.
Sure, absolutely. All right. Well, we've got Dr. Rider back with us today. I'm excited about this. Why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about what he's going to be doing for us?
I'll be glad to. I'm glad to have Todd here again. This is the second of his sessions on the German bombs and nuclear program. He introduced the idea to us, and he's done an enormous amount of research. Introduced the idea to us before, and he will bring us up on some more information about his research today. And we've already talked a bit about this. I'm going to go ahead and insert it now, and we'll mention it again at the end. But Todd would welcome questions. If you are watching this on YouTube or Facebook and you have questions about what he's presenting, if you'll just put that in comments, I'll be looking for it, and we'll have him on later, and we will use those questions to get a question and answer session going. So obviously you can comment other ways. You can send an email or text, but if you'll just comment to the YouTube video or to the video, well, it'll be on the YouTube video regardless of where you look at it. So we'll use that to get questions. Todd, go ahead and start your presentation, and thanks for coming back again.
Oh, thank you both very much for inviting me back. It's great to be back. So let me start by acknowledging again all the various archives around the world that have helped with us. This would not have been possible without files from all around the world, and all the people around the world who have helped with this research. In particular, this time, I'd really like to acknowledge two people, Frank Dubert and Norberto La Huerta, who were the first researchers who found archival evidence of the true German H-bomb program, and I'll be presenting some of that. Also, just so the three of us do not get thrown into Guantanamo, let me point out from the very beginning that everything we're talking about here, all my slides, the book, everything is drawn purely from unclassified sources. So previously on As the Nerd Turns, we had talked about some of the evidence for the German fission bomb program. There's quite a bit of archival evidence that's been recently rediscovered that Germany was developing fission bombs during the war and may well have even tested them successfully during the war. What I want to talk about now is additional archival evidence that during the war, German and Austrian scientists were working on applications of fusion for bombs. And they were doing that in several different ways. So there's evidence that they developed fusion neutron generators using fusion fuel and high voltage. And those would be suitable for initiating a neutron chain reaction in a fission bomb. So a small fusion component for a fission bomb. The second way they appear to developed was putting a small amount of fusion fuel at the center of a fission implosion bomb. And that would not generate that much fusion energy, but it would generate a lot of neutrons. And those neutrons would aid the fission chain reaction and improve its efficiency and its explosive energy yield. So it's called fusion boosting. There's evidence the Germans were doing that. And then they developed, or were developing, an honest-to-goodness H-bomb, hydrogen bomb, that had a fission bomb as a trigger or primary, but then instead of developing a kiloton level explosion like a fission bomb, would have developed a megaton level explosion using solid storable lithium deuteride fusion fuel as the secondary, if you will. And then there's also evidence that after the war, many of the German and Austrian nuclear experts involved in this went to the US or to other countries and had a large impact on post-war programs there. So I'm going to run through all this very quickly, but for people who want to see it in more detail, these slides, far more information is on my website. So please stare at it for as long as you want afterward. And please do send in questions if anybody has any questions. So the first application of fusion and bombs in the German program was high voltage fusion neutron initiators. And this work began very early. So no later than 1928, a number of German scientists and Austrian scientists started studying how fusion works in stars. Fritz Hautermans in Germany, Georg Stetter in Austria, They continued this for several years during the 1930s. The physics of fusion in stars was ultimately fairly much polished off in Germany by Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and then by Hans Bethe, who had started his career in Germany and then moved to the US, and of course most famously became the first head of the theoretical division at Los Alamos. But they moved from stars to terrestrial applications very quickly. So here's a patent from 1934 on how to do fusion on the Earth. And this was from a couple of guys, Arno Brasch and Fritz Lange, who were working at the German electric company AEG in Berlin. And this German name literally means General Electric. This was the German equivalent of General Electric, not affiliated with the US General Electric, but quite comparable to it. So a very large electrical electronics company with the resources to do research in any areas that they wanted. And here they were starting to get into fusion and creating fusion reactions if you apply enough voltage to fusion fuel. So here's the first patent on it in 1934. By 1938, there were two additional people there working on Hartmut Kalman and Ernst Kuhn. And so they filed this patent in 1938. They had perfected a nice little sealed tube that applied a high voltage to fusion fuel, such as lithium and deuterium, and would generate enough fusion reactions to produce very high energy neutrons. And those could be used as a neutron source. They were thinking about medical imaging and things initially, but later this seems to have also been used in bombs. So detailed information from them, and you'll see this AEG company pop up over and over. They seem to have been a major player in this German program on fusion bombs. So they developed those high voltage neutron generators, and then over the course of the war, those appear to have been mass produced and used for a number of applications in German science. So here are some examples I've pulled out of archives of built versions of these high voltage fusion neutron generators being used in different labs for different purposes. And then quite intriguingly, here is a post-war Allied interview of a professor in Europe who reported that in the latter stages of the war, the SS came around and started rounding up every high voltage fusion neutron generator they could find in German occupied Europe and confiscating them. And when they were asked why they needed all these, they said it was for new weapons that they were producing. So these were all rounded up and used by the SS. There's further evidence of that. So last time I showed you guys this report. This was from the Soviet general who was head of military intelligence, GRU, writing to Stalin in March 1945, giving a very detailed description from Soviet intelligence on what the German fission implosion bomb was like, its design, and also reporting it had been successfully tested multiple times. I won't drag you through all that again. I just want to point out that included in the detailed design he gave for the German bomb is specific mention of high voltage discharge tubes to produce neutrons. So that is repeated here several times in the description, these high voltage fusion tubes to produce neutrons to initiate the reaction in this fission implosion bomb. It's described multiple times. Now, he also said that the fusion fuel was placed at the center of that bomb. So within the fission fuel will be surrounding that fusion fuel within that. And that means that potentially the fusion fuel could have been used for boosting purposes as well. That is described by a number of other sources. These were descriptions from Erich Schumann, one of the major designers of the German bomb. And he specifically showed the use of fusion fuel at the very center, then surrounded by fission fuel, and then surrounded by the conventional explosives used for the implosion process. So again, that fusion fuel at the center would not have generated much energy, but it would have generated neutrons, and those neutrons would have triggered more chain reactions in the fission fuel than otherwise would have happened. And so it would have increased the explosive yield of the fission fuel, potentially quite a lot with this fusion boosting. So this was described by Schumann, and he gave detailed descriptions of exactly what fusion fuels he was considering. He seems to have been especially fond of deuterium and lithium. You see this trend over and over, this theme of deuterium and lithium in all this German work. Schumann was working with Kurt Diebner during the war. After the war, Kurt Diebner also blabbed and showed these designs with fusion fuel at the center, surrounded by fission fuel. Kurt Diebner was a little hardcore. His fusion fuel preference was deuterium tritium that he indicated here in this document. And then Kurt Diebner filed his own patents after the war, and these appear to have been based on wartime work. And that Russian intelligence report that I showed you, if I understand it correctly, seems to say that at the center of the German bomb was fusion fuel that was activated by high voltage. So it served as a neutron initiator with high voltage. And by being fusion fuel at the center of the bomb, it served for fusion boosting, if I understand that correctly. So this post-war patent from Kurt Diebner, who again was involved with the wartime bomb program, appears to show precisely that. It shows a central compartment for an implosion bomb. And in this central compartment is deuterium, tritium, and lithium fusion fuel. It applies a high voltage, and then the neutrons are available to everything around that, including any fission fuel during the implosion process. So this is the design, of course, of the US version of an implosion bomb, so the Gadget and Fat Man design. But there is enough detailed evidence from these German sources to put the German fission bomb design right alongside the US design. In general, they're quite similar, but there are a few key differences. So for the US bomb, the first US bombs used a neutron initiator that was fairly primitive. It was called the Urchin. It had beryllium and polonium in it to generate neutrons. In contrast, the Germans appear to have gone straight to these high voltage fusion neutron tubes. And the US appears to have ultimately adopted those later, many years after the war. So in that respect, this was many years more advanced than what the US was doing. And indeed, if the Germans were doing fusion boosting, if they had enough fusion fuel at the center to increase the explosive yield, that was something that the US did not do until many years after the war. And that boosting could have either made the German wartime bombs much more powerful than the US bombs. So if a US bomb was 20 kilotons, the Germans might have achieved far higher than that with their bombs if they wanted to. Or by improving the efficiency, they potentially could have had smaller bombs, use smaller amounts of fission fuel, and get comparable yields, but from a smaller amount of fuel and a smaller bomb. So really impressively advanced technology. But these German fission bombs were reported by Erich Schumann, by Werner Grothmann, by various sources, consistently as being spherical bombs with a mass, a weight of about 2,000 kilograms. But there was another bomb that was reported in numerous sources in the archives. This bomb was said to have a mass of 6 tons, so far larger. And this appears to have been a true H-bomb, a German H-bomb that was under development. Here's an overview of some of those sources. And across the board, the sources will report that the weight of the bomb was 6 tons. They will report across the board that the expected explosive yield of the bomb was in megatons, as opposed to the kiloton level yields you'd expect for a fission bomb. They report across the board that the bomb used lithium deuteride or similar materials triggered by a fission bomb primary. And several of them report that this bomb was not just a paper drawing, but it was a program in active development, and it was at such an advanced stage, if the war had continued, the Germans were expecting to test their H-bomb later in 1945 or 1946 at the latest. And they were actually designing delivery vehicles to deliver their bomb, custom delivery to New York, when you care enough to send the very best. These sources also consistently name the same people and places involved in this. And repeatedly, it's AEG, the electrical company I showed you before, and it's a group of scientists in Austria, plus some others. So here's an interview with one of Heinrich Himmler's top adjutants, top assistants. Of course, Himmler was in charge of the SS. One of his top adjutants was Werner Grothmann, and later in life, Werner Grothmann was interviewed and spilled the beans and said, yeah, during the war, we had 3 programs. There was our program to develop a uranium bomb. That went great. There was our program to develop plutonium bombs. That was going well. And we had a 3rd program to develop the hydrogen bomb. And we're expecting that to be ready by 1946 at the latest. And separately in these interviews, he was asked about the design of the bombs. He knew quite a bit from personal experience about the design of the fission implosion bombs. He was less involved with the H-bomb program. So all he could say was it must have looked like a swollen bomb in its design. And that's an intriguing bit of evidence. We'll come back to that later. He says that Himmler was fascinated, was electrified by what the German and Austrian physicists were telling him, that the H-bomb would have an explosive power 100 times greater than that of a fission bomb. And indeed, that is correct. So if a fission bomb has a yield of tens of kilotons, then they're talking about megaton level yields they expect from the German H-bomb. And then adding some confirmation to that, this is a post-war interrogation report on one of Himmler's other adjutants. And this adjutant, says, yes, indeed, Werner Grothmann was indeed the other top adjutant of Himmler. And he reports that Himmler had a board of scientific advisors. So Himmler had 11 people, 11 top scientists reporting to him, giving him advice. And of these 11 scientists, 6 of them were nuclear experts. And the other 5 were earth science experts with expertise that'd be quite relevant if you plan to go setting off nuclear bombs. So all this gives us some idea of what Himmler and the SS had in mind. Here is another post-war interrogation report. This is from somebody that the Soviets captured. And he names some of the same people in this, Gerlach and Tomaszek, as being involved in this German H-bomb program. He names Georg Stetter in Vienna as being a key participant and says that they were trying to create lithium hydride or lithium deuteride bombs. And we'll come back to Stetter in just a moment. And he says that they had something so powerful that they were worried about exploding their whole experimental facility if it went off. So Georg Stetter was named there. He indeed seems to have been perhaps the central person of this. This may be the person most entitled to be called the father of the H-bomb. So Georg Stetter had been doing nuclear physics at the University of Vienna since the 1920s. And he was surrounded by a very talented group of scientists that he managed and helped there. In 1939, he filed a patent on both fission and fusion reactions and devices. Here's part of that here, talking about fusion, talking about deuterium, tritium, and so forth, results in an explosion of tremendous energy. You can kind of see what he had in mind from the outset. And then throughout the war, Stetter and his colleagues appear to have worked on both fission bombs and fusion bombs. Here are post-war reports that I found in the archives, intelligence reports, and they say that indeed during the war there was work on a German heavy hydrogen bomb, a weapon even more deadly than the atomic bomb. This work was begun by Georg Stetter, working on lithium hydride bombs they planned to set off. Lithium hydride bombs, Georg Stetter, lithium hydride bombs, Georg Stetter, all through these reports confirmed. This is a really fascinating report. Wolfgang Farrant was a scientist who worked both in Austria, so potentially both with people like, surrounded Georg Stetter, and he worked simultaneously for AEG. So he was a linkage between these two. And at the end of the war, he was rounded up by US occupation forces in Austria. And they told him his homework was to sit down and write down what he'd been up to for the last several years. So he sat down, he wrote this up. And bear in mind that what he produced was probably heavily censored by the US. And he was probably heavily censoring himself because he didn't want to get shot. So this is the censored polite version of what he knew, what he was working on. He talks about using lithium dihydride well suited as the choice of substance to cause reactions to produce a source of neutrons. The neutrons would produce strong fission reactions in surrounding uranium and liberate large amounts of energy. The lithium dihydride recipient, which may mean the secondary, would be surrounded by a coat of uranium, which may mean the uranium casing. Its goal in all this work was the result in the explosion of the entire lithium deuteride mass, since the reaction zone is capable of enlarging itself on the strength of its own energy production. So creating a self-sustaining and propagating thermonuclear explosive wave in the fuel, exactly as a good H-bomb should do. Again, this was not simply a paper project or a paper concept. Here is another report. This was found by Frank Durbert, one of the researchers I mentioned. This is one of the very first pieces of evidence for this program that was rediscovered in archives. And this was an interrogation report by the Allies, again, of people in Austria. And so they were reporting that they had been working on creating, building, assembling, getting ready to test a, quote, new radioactive bomb weighing 6 tons, which was to be lowered by parachute from a plane. And I think the parachute is a key piece of evidence. So a fission bomb obviously creates a large explosion, but the explosion is not so large that a plane can't get to a safe distance before the bomb goes off. Even a World War II era plane, as happened with Enola Gay and Boxcar and so forth. So you kind of chuck it out the window, it falls to the optimum burst height, and you can fly away in time. But an H-bomb has a much more powerful blast, and it's much harder for a plane to get to a safe distance before that goes off. So if you chuck one of those out the window, you kind of prefer for it to have a parachute on the bomb, so the bomb falls more slowly, you have more time to get away. Here they describe the 6-ton bomb that was radioactive needed a parachute for the plane to get away. It names a number of people involved in this and says that a number of people had been rounded up by these Allied investigators. And one of those was a guy named Edmund Zorg. I'll show you more in a moment. It also says that in July 1944, people affiliated with this whole program were scouting for a test site for this bomb in northern Finland. So if you have a small fission bomb, then sure, there are all kinds of places you can set it off. Pick your neighbor's house when they're not home. But if you have a large H-bomb, that creates so much destruction, you have to find a good place for it. And so they were scouting for a location in northern Finland. But again, it indicates they were very close to testing this later in 45 or at the latest in 1946. And throughout this, there's mention of people they've rounded up, interrogations, reports they're writing, all of this. But this is all that we have currently. So where are all these other reports that were written? Where are all these interrogation transcripts? They must exist in archives someplace. Here's another one we have from that. As I mentioned, Edmund Zorg was implicated in this. He was promptly rounded up by the powers that be. They threw him into the dustbin Allied Interrogation Center. They asked him what he knew, and his response was, "I know nothing, nothing." So he said that, they wrote that down, but they kept working on him. And so after a couple months, he was a little more compliant and a little more open. And so he admitted that, yes, he actually had been involved in developing this thing. It seems that he was involved on the Luftwaffe end in exactly how the Luftwaffe planes could load and transport and drop something as large as this planned 6-ton bomb, but again, indicating it was close to final testing and use. He also says that both he and his superior, Colonel Peterson, had been extensively interrogated by both the British and the Americans. So these reports, these interrogation transcripts must be in the archives someplace. But all this talk about the 6-ton bomb, here's more talk about a 6-ton bomb. Hans Turing was an Austrian physicist who does not appear to have been directly involved in this program during the war. But after the war, he was sitting around having drinks with somebody who was, and used the information from that to write up a whole book about it. And so he talks about the lithium hydride bomb under development based on this Austrian wartime information. The goal is to produce, in effect, several thousand times as large as before, so megatons instead of kilotons of explosive yield. In fact, he says, God have mercy on the country over which a 6-ton bomb of lithium hydride is made to explode. I have no idea what country they might be talking about here. I'll show you that in a moment. And he also says specifically that the lithium hydride or lithium deuteride would be triggered by a uranium bomb or plutonium bomb as the spark plug or as the primary. All right, so what country could they possibly mean here? Well, I have evidence from the archives of at least 3 different rocket programs to develop rockets capable of carrying a payload specifically listed as 6 tons, no lighter, but 6 tons, and attack on New York, attack on New York, attack on New York. So they were going places. They also had a very good idea of the blast radius of this bomb. So I have repeated reports here that they were expecting a blast radius of 10 kilometers or 6 miles, whether it's given in metric or English in these various reports. So it comes from a number of different sources, 21st Army interrogations. This is from the Italian ambassador in Berlin reporting directly in 1944. They're working on something that has a 10-kilometer blast radius. And so if you take this idea of a 10-kilometer blast radius, and if you use your handy nuclear bomb effects computer, never leave home without it, then you find that that corresponds as a very conservative estimate to at least about 1.6 megatons or so. So again, we're talking about something with a megaton yield level that they were expecting. So what was the actual design? We know that the bomb weighed 6 tons. We know that the yield was intended to be megatons. We know that it had a fission trigger. We know that it had lithium deuteride fusion fuel. But what was the actual configuration? And we have less information directly on that. According to the completely unclassified literature, there are 2 different general categories of H-bomb designs that work. There is something that the Russians called a sloika or layer cake. The Americans called an alarm clock. This is a spherical implosion bomb, but it has multiple concentric layers of alternating fission and fusion fuel. And after the war, Kurt Diebner, who was up to his eyebrows in this stuff, was drawing all kinds of diagrams of lots and lots of concentric layers. So they may have been thinking along these lines. On the other hand, the unclassified sources say that the other possible H-bomb design, the one that we tend to prefer nowadays apparently, 9 out of 10 mad scientists prefer it, is that there is a separate fission bomb primary and separate fission fuel secondary. This is called a 2-stage design, sometimes called the Teller-Ulam design. So there's evidence that the Germans may have been considering that. Kurt Diebner had a student named Friedrich Winterberg who came to the US after the war and drew this diagram of a 2-stage design. But actually during the war, Walter Gerlach, another scientist involved in this program, was drawing diagrams like this, with the same sort of ellipsoid with 2 foci for the primary, the secondary, the casing, and right next to it, lots of equations of fusion reactions. So this is straight out of the Deutsches Museum archive in Munich. Again, I come back to what Werner Grothmann, Himmler's assistant, said. He didn't know much about the design of the H-bomb, but he said it must have looked like a swollen bomb. And you could imagine that as applying potentially to either one of these concepts. Now, to produce a lithium deuteride bomb, you have to produce deuterium, you have to produce lithium, and they were getting busy doing that. As I mentioned last time on your program, there's evidence for at least 20 or so plants that were producing heavy water and deuterium all over Europe. There's evidence from archives that the US has all kinds of reports about these plants, but still won't release them. That's not mysterious at all. It's also helpful to have tritium as well as deuterium. And as I showed last time, there's evidence that there may have been some larger production fission reactors, maybe even ones that went into operation. If they were using that heavy water as moderator, they could have produced tritium from the deuterium and heavy water. There's also quite a bit of evidence, which I don't have time to get into here, but in my book, there's a lot of evidence that there was an electronuclear breeding program in wartime Germany. That means using particle accelerators to produce either fission fuel or fusion fuel, and that could have been used to produce tritium as well. They were producing lithium, large amounts of lithium, tons and tons of lithium. Here are post-war documents straight out of the archives documenting how much they were producing. In fact, the Allied investigators were so impressed, they said the use of lithium apparently has progressed further in Germany than the United States. So Germany was very advanced with its lithium production processing capabilities. And this was not just natural lithium, but they were separating lithium into its isotopes, lithium-6 and lithium-7. These are two different natural isotopes of lithium, and lithium-6 is a little preferable for H-bombs. So during the war, Alfred Klemm and other scientists had perfected methods of separating lithium-6 from lithium-7. I really can't think of any other major applications for which this would have been suitable. So it kind of gives you an idea of what they were thinking. Here's a wartime report from Klemm to Walter Gerlach. Here is a post-war publication. He wrote bragging about his wartime work. And then late in his life, Klemm was interviewed by a researcher in Germany, Heiko Petermann. And Klemm looked very nervous as soon as the interviewer showed up, tried to get rid of the interviewer, but said, yeah, I perfected this whole lithium-6, lithium-7 isotope separation thing in 1942. So there was plenty of time to scale it up potentially during the war. He also admitted that the tritium problem, as he called it, how you produce enough tritium, was well known, and there seems to have been other people, not Klemm, who were working on this during the war. More evidence for lithium isotope separation after the war. Many German nuclear scientists went to the Soviet Union. They were immediately put to work essentially reproducing whatever they'd been doing in Germany. And here are documents mentioning several German scientists who were put to work on producing lithium-6 and producing tritium. So Gustav Hertz, Werner Schütze, and Manfred von Ardenne. In fact, von Ardenne won the Stalin Prize because he was so great at purifying lithium-6 for Stalin. So it suggests, but does not prove conclusively, that they were also involved in this wartime lithium-6 production. All right, so let's finish off here. Not only did these German and Austrian nuclear experts seem to do a lot of work during the war in Germany, but after the war, as you saw there, they went to other countries. They appear to have had a large impact on the post-war nuclear programs in other countries, including the United States. Here are some photos. These are from the so-called paperclip files, the foreign scientist case files at the National Archives. And there were dozens of scientists directly involved in the German nuclear program or with detailed knowledge of the German nuclear program who were brought to the United States to work after the war. For all these scientists, presumably they just weren't hired on the spot. You look like a German scientist, okay, we'll hire you, we'll bring you to the US. There must be interviews, there must be interrogation transcripts, there must be reports for all this. But once they were brought to the US, there must be further reports for what work they were actually doing, what they wrote up. And as far as I can find, these interrogation transcripts, these interrogation reports that they wrote are completely unavailable still for all these people. A lot of those people worked in the German H-bomb program as well as the fission bomb program. Here's a good example. Siegfried Frege, who I briefly mentioned last time, appears to have been the top theoretical physicist of the German nuclear program. His claim to fame first was in 1939, publishing a paper with detailed calculations of fission bombs and fission reactors. But then during the war, he worked simultaneously for almost every agency and organization in Germany that was working on nuclear bombs. So people think of these as separate programs, but here's the one guy who's working at all these different places. So he's working for the army, he's working for the post office, he's working for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, he's working for the SS, he's working for the Reichsforschungsrat, he's working at Königsberg, which is reported to have a fission reactor in other sources. He's working at the Gusen SS facility, which is another possible fission reactor. So he's kind of the indispensable man working at all these different nuclear sites, nuclear places. So as I mentioned last time, after the war, he was brought to the US at the specific request of Edward Teller. So in 1947, Edward Teller was trying to become the father of the H-bomb, and he was having a little trouble conceiving. And so he wrote this letter, or he had this letter written on his behalf, desperately pleading to have specifically Siegfried Flügge, nobody else, Siegfried Flügge, put on a plane and shipped to the US as quickly as possible. And so the US authorities in Europe did that. They rounded up Siegfried Flügge, they brought him to the US, and he worked in the US at 2 different points for quite some time prior to the US completing its H-bomb. So Flügge was brought to the US at Teller's insistence to work on that program of great national security importance. When he was not in the US, occasionally wanted to go back to Europe, stretch his feet. So at those times, he was placed on what was called the hot list and constantly monitored by the US Army Counterintelligence Corps, basically the men in black. So they sat on him and they just kind of follow him around everywhere, you know, hang around in his apartment, whatever. So in his files at College Park, I found even letters from Flügge complaining, could you please not have the men in black follow me into the donut shop? It's just embarrassing. So they were just following him around everywhere. And here you can see custodial detention, but they kept doing this until the mid-1950s. Now, even if Flügge were involved in the German fission bomb program, one would think that as soon as the Soviets perfected their own fission bomb in 1949, that then they would say, okay, Flügge doesn't know anything else that the Soviets don't already know, so we can let him go. But they didn't let him go until at least the mid-1950s, after the Soviet Union had perfected their H-bomb, suggesting that Flügge knew an awful lot about the H-bomb, which is why Teller had wanted him. Here's another example. This is Ulrich Jetter. After the war, he published a paper and some books giving details of how H-bombs work. And this appears to have been based on wartime work. He was working with a number of groups during the war, but publishing specifically how you can use lithium deuteride to generate a fusion reaction cycle. And then after the war, he was brought to the United States. Before the US perfected its own H-bomb, he was brought as a cultural exchange fellow to Washington. Somehow I don't think he was brought to Washington to discuss the poetry of Goethe. Another example is Stetter. I mentioned that Stetter may have been the most central figure in all of this. Here is a post-war interrogation report. This is quite interesting. So this report was written by a scientist named Tian Odorenko, who was a very high-ranking physicist at AT&T Bell Labs for many years before the war. He rounded up all kinds of information and brought it back to the US, including Bell Labs, which I think jump-started a lot of research there. But specifically, Odorenko says, I've been talking to the Stetter guy in Austria, and Stetter is currently being imprisoned, confined by US forces, but in an attempt to talk his way out of confinement, Stetter is telling me that if we'll just let him and let his people out of imprisonment and give them back some of their stuff, that they'd be very happy to make an atomic bomb for us, and they could deliver the first one within just a couple months. So very, very interesting information here. This seems to have had the opposite effect to what Stetter intended. So they did not let him out of prison. Instead, they sat on him even harder. Odorenko continued to extract information from Georg Stetter. And it turns out that Stetter and his people around him were so brilliant that in their spare time, in addition to developing fission bombs and H-bombs, in their spare time, they were developing stealth radar absorbing coatings for vehicles, such as now are used on stealth aircraft. by the United States. So this is all duly written up and brought back to the United States and used here. And Stetter and his people had developed the correct modern theory of superconductivity, that electrons work in pairs in superconductors. And so all this was written up, brought back to the United States. And a few decades later, somebody in the United States proudly announced the discovery of this that had been discovered earlier by Georg Stetter and his people. So Stetter and his other researchers never received any credit or payment for any of this. Instead, Stetter was sentenced to house confinement from 1945 until sometime in the 1950s. In fact, he was so tightly confined, they knew he knew so much dangerous stuff, they wouldn't even let him out of the house. They wouldn't even let him go to the library, not even with an escort. So here they're saying they won't even let him go to the library. And he had spent his career prior to that working for several decades in nuclear physics, as I showed, just phenomenal track record in nuclear physics, as well as the other things in stealth and superconductivity. He was a scientist. He just had to do science, but he was locked up with this little room with the men in black sitting on him. He had to do science, so he became an expert in dust. I think dust was probably about the only thing he had access to. And so he became the world's leading expert on the science of dust. And he kind of changed careers, and after that was an expert on dust. But there's evidence from these files at College Park that he was closely monitored by the CIC, the Men in Black, again until the mid-1950s, after the Soviet Union had perfected its own H-bomb, and there was nothing that they could have learned from Stetter that they didn't already know. Here's another example from the files. This is another German nuclear physicist, Otto Haxel. And what he did during the war is quite mysterious. He has a whole paperclip file at NARA, long detailed file, but all the pages in the file have been replaced by National Archives cards saying access restricted, file withdrawn, access restricted, file withdrawn, all these yellow cards. Some other researcher before me tried to find out why this was restricted, what was behind this. So they did a Freedom of Information Act request for his file, for all the pages in his file. And the agency said, sure, we're complying with your Freedom of Information Act request. Here are all of the pages from Otto Haxel's file, but they had all been completely blanked out. So returned all entirely blank pages. So yes, there's nothing suspicious about this at all. So there's enough evidence that's been found so far from archives to indicate that there was some kind of large and advanced program to develop an H-bomb in Germany during the war, as well as the fission bomb program. We don't really have to speculate about what that might be or wonder what that might be, because it appears from what I've shown you that most of the key players in this program were either interrogated by the US or actually went to work for the US. And so the answers to all of this must be in US files. We just have to get these files released. And these files should be able to tell us, all these post-war interrogation transcripts, reports, and things should be able to tell us exactly how far these wartime German nuclear weapons programs got, and exactly how much post-war influence they may have had. As I said, things like using high voltage fusion tubes as neutron initiators in bombs, which the US did not do during the war, but started to do after the war, just like the Germans had been doing during the war. Or H-bombs using lithium deuteride and all this stuff. So how much influence did they have? We don't have to speculate. The answers are already there in the files. We just have to get it released.
Wow. Wow.
So I know I blew through that very quickly, but if people want to see the slides all over again, or see the book with all these archival documents themselves, they can go to my website here, so riderinstitute.org, and you can see more than you ever wanted to see in your life.
Okay, Todd, I thank you very much for that. And I agree, your website has an enormous amount of information. And I appreciate you taking the time to go through it today and present the evidence that you found for the H-bomb program especially. And as mentioned, we would welcome questions for Todd to follow up with on a later program that we plan. So if you want to ask questions, please put them in the comments or get them to me, or obviously there's a method on his website to reach him as well. But we would like to have those questions so we can do a follow-up program with him later.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, what struck me, excuse me, a lot of, as you were talking about, particularly the lithium, you know, the lithium work that was going on, is the some of the similarities, or at least the parallel work between what was being done in the U.S. I know, you know, Oak Ridge, for example, there was, you know, lithium work that was done. Of course, Ray can probably go on and on about that, but you know, there was that would be interesting at some point to look at what are the parallels between what was being done in Germany and what was being done in the U.S., either at the same time or later. I think
Colex. I believe it was called Colex.
Yeah.
Y12 in the 1950s, 1960s was separating lithium-6, lithium-7 using the mercury process.
Yep.
What they call the Colex process. Yes, it would be absolutely fascinating to do a deep dive into the archives and to see if that program was truly an independent post-war invention, or if the origins of that program were information received from some of these German and Austrian scientists from wartime German work on lithium separation.
So let me tell you, the smartest man I ever knew was Dr. John Guggen. John Guggen, G-O-O-G-I-N, is the man that created the Colex, column exchange process at Y12. He was an amazing individual. He's also the one that they showed pictures of Iraq, what was going on in Iraq, and he told them, this is the first Iraq war now, he told them they're building a little Y12 here, here, and here. So they sent rockets in and blew those places up, and then they sent ground troops in later, and they found drawings from Y12 actually in those facilities. So Dr. Guggen created the Colex process at Y12. Whether he had any connection to any of the information you're finding now, I have no evidence to indicate he did. Not that he would have told me had he done that, but the man had the most intelligence of anyone I have ever met. He could knock you over just by asking you a question. In other words, he could get to the essence of the issue so quick that it would just be astounding. So if you ever find Dr. John Guggen and German scientists connected in a document, I'd sure love to know it.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rider. We appreciate it. And we look forward to having you back again in the not too distant future. And like Ray said, folks, if you've got a question about any of this, either this presentation or the previous presentation, please, send it to us. You can post it in the comments, either on Facebook or on YouTube, wherever you're watching this, and we'll be able to, we'll compile some questions together and then kind of have a Q&A session with Dr. Rider at a later date. So, Ray, who do we have coming up next?
Well, the next one that's scheduled is Jim Dodson. Jim is a city councilman for the city of Oak Ridge, and he's also an art teacher at the Jefferson Middle School. He's been influential in getting some of the art sculptures that are around Oak Ridge and also the murals that have been painted there. He and I are going to be dedicating a historical marker from the Tennessee Historical Commission at the large outdoor pool. And he's also on the board of the AMSI Foundation and also the Oak Ridge Heritage and Preservation Association. So we will be interested in letting Jim talk about his perspective on history and Oak Ridge and what he sees, not only for what we're doing now and in the recent past, but possibly he can help us to understand some of the things that's being accomplished and looking forward a little bit as to what the city council is doing regarding the historical significance of activities and things in Oak Ridge. So look forward to him on forward. Jim
is a good friend to many people, to me included, And to say that Jim Dodson is an art teacher is kind of like saying Warren Buffett is a businessman. You know, it's true.
I got it.
He's so much more. He is so much more than an art teacher, and has
Right.
so many things for so many people. So
he is. He's involved in the arts, not only in Oak Ridge, but in the Knoxville, East Tennessee and the state area. So he's heavily involved in the arts. He
is. All right. Well, that sounds good. And that'll be coming up in a couple of weeks. And that sounds great. All right, Ray, anything else?
No, that's it. And thanks again to Todd.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rider. We appreciate it. And folks, thank you for watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks.
Welcome to today's Hidden History, Stories from the Secret City. I'm Ray Smith, and Keith McDaniel will not be with us today. He's got some sickness in his home, but I'm glad that we have Todd Rider with us again today. He's going to talk to us about the nuclear weapons and other weapons, I think, in the German arsenal back during World War II. His book, Forgotten Creators, is a wealth of information about that and other things. But I'm glad to have Todd with us today. And oh, by the way, we've agreed that we're going to do a follow-up session for our next Hidden Histories to put a wrap on the series that Todd has been bringing us with this information. So Todd, take it away and tell us what you've got planned for us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me back. And before we start, let me just point out that as with my previous presentations, what I'm presenting is not only my own work, but the work of a lot of people who've worked for many years in archives around the world. And that absolutely everything I'm going to talk about, everything in my book, is drawn purely from unclassified sources. So with that out of the way, I'd like to talk about the nuclear triad. And the nuclear triad is usually defined as the methods of delivering nuclear weapons either by land-launched missiles or sub-launched missiles or intercontinental jet bombers. And for the last 75 years, we've thought of the nuclear triad as something that was developed post-war, after World War II, by the US and Soviet Union as part of the Cold War. And I'm going to show evidence that indicates that actually the nuclear triad was developed, or at least under development, in Germany during World War II, and furthermore, that the components of the nuclear triad, the technologies, were then transferred to the US and other countries after the war. So we'll cover that, the different aspects of the nuclear triad. In this presentation, I'll only talk about the land-launched missiles. If there's enough box office to warrant a sequel, then we'll come back and we'll talk about sub-launched missiles and the jet bombers in some future presentation. Previously on the Nerd and High Castle, we had talked about the nuclear weapons programs in Germany during the war. There is evidence that they were developing at least 3 types of nuclear weapons. There was a small one, which was a mass of probably around 300 kilograms or so, and had a yield probably less than a kiloton, and was developed for tactical battlefield applications. There's evidence that this project was highly advanced, possibly finished and tested by the end of the war. Then there was the regular sized one with a mass of about 2 metric tons, a yield, if deployed, of probably tens of kilotons, and it does appear to have been successfully tested during the war. And then there was the supersized version, which was 6 tons with a yield probably in the megaton range. This would have been a full-fledged H-bomb, quite advanced for its time. And there's no evidence it was tested during the war, but the sources involved in this say that there were plans to test it if the war continued, to test it later in 1945 or at the latest 1946. So this would have been in a very advanced stage of development. Now, surveys have shown that 9 out of 10 mad scientists prefer to have both a nuclear weapon and some method to deliver their nuclear weapon. And so if Germany was developing nuclear weapons, it stands to reason they also were developing methods to deliver these nuclear weapons to Allied targets. And that's where the nuclear triad delivery systems come in. So we'll talk today just about the land-launched intercontinental missiles. And those came in various flavors. Let's start off with liquid propellant missiles. The one that everybody is most familiar with is the V2 rocket, also called the A4. The German rocket engineers had a whole A series, different A numbers of rockets that they were developing. So I'll generally use that A4 nomenclature. But once it was used in the war, it was known as the Vengeance Weapon 2 or V2. And V2 became something of a generic name. So just like we might use the word Kleenex to refer to any sort of tissues, or Xerox to refer to any sort of photocopy, V2 could be used in a generic sense in some of these documents to refer to any kind of large German rocket. So the standard A4 had a length of 14 meters, nearly 50 feet tall. It's quite impressive if you're standing next to one of these things. Its standard payload was 1 ton, 1 metric ton. The launch mass was about 14 tons, thrust was about 27 tons, had a range of 300 kilometers, so it could get over the English Channel. It was first flown successfully in October 1942, so over 2.5 years before the end of the war, first successful flight, and they built over 6,000 of these during the war. So it's a very impressive rocket. It's also very well documented in all the history books. What people are less familiar with, but what you can actually find in the history books if you dig hard enough, is a variant of this called the A4B or the A9. Essentially, they added wings to it. And with the wings, once it had exhausted its propellant, then it could keep on gliding and glide to its target. And so it had an extended range. That was the idea anyway. Otherwise, the specifications were very similar between the A4B and the A4. So according to the official history books, they built about 10 of these. They launched 2 of them. Neither of those launches was fully successful. And then the program ended. And I will show you some evidence to indicate this may have gone beyond that, beyond just these couple of unmanned A9 or A4B launches. There are other variations. Officially, nothing else other than those 2 I just showed you was built, but there's some evidence that there were other interesting things that were built. And so an author named Philip Henschel was digging through the British National Archives and came across blueprints for A4 rockets that had been modified such that they had a central chamber here that was hollow. And so here, Henschel has redrawn it, showing the central chamber in the rocket. Now, the drawings don't explain what they intended to put in this chamber, but it was clearly not propellant. It was something else. And his theory and mine was they intended to put a warhead here. As I mentioned, the mid-size German nuclear warhead had a mass of 2 tons. The standard A4 was designed for a payload of 1 ton. So if you are loading up a small boat and distributing weight around, and at the very last moment, somebody gives you an oversized, very heavy thing to put on the boat, you could put the very heavy thing on one end of the boat and then rearrange everything else, but that's a lot of work. It's much easier if you put the very heavy last minute addition in the center of the boat. And I think that's what they were doing here. They're trying to put the oversized warhead near the center of mass, center of gravity for the rocket. Then there are other variations on the A4 that may have been built during the war. One straightforward thing to do would be simply to make it longer. So after the war, the Soviets captured a lot of German rocket engineers and technology. They built more A4s, which they called the R1 or the SS1 in the Soviet arsenal, but they also built extended A4s. So the standard A4 was 14 meters long. The Soviets also built 18-meter and 21-meter versions called the SS2 and SS3, respectively. And over in the US, von Braun and his buddies were also building 21-meter long V2s, except they called them the Redstone or the Jupiter C. But so a 21-meter long V2 or A4, basically. And it's possible that the German engineers in the United States were having teleconferences with the German engineers in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but it seems quite unlikely to me. So I think probably both of these German teams were basing their post-war work on wartime programs that had developed or been trying to develop extended length stretch limo versions of the A4. And I'll show you some evidence of this shortly. Now we come to an interesting part of the story that ties some of these elements together. This was a photo of some of the lead German rocket engineers being congratulated at their base at Peenemünde in 1942 after the first successful test flight of the A4. And so in a black suit back here, looking suitably proud and ominous, this is Werner von Braun. This is his immediate boss, Walter Dornberger. But this person here is Heinz Stölzl. So he clearly existed. He was clearly important. And yet he has almost vanished from the history books. You will not find him in many of the history books now. But here he is in this photo. And apparently shortly after this, in 1942, he was dispatched from Peenemünde to a different rocket base, an underground facility in Thuringia in the middle of Germany. And we know this because we have some of his mail. This is left over from his estate after he died. So he was receiving mail at Erfurt. And one might think that he was at Nordhausen. Nordhausen, Mittelbau-Dora, is the very large, well-known underground rocket facility in Thuringia. But this is someplace else. This seems to be a different facility where he was. So he was doing very interesting, very mysterious work in the later years of the war. And then after the war, all the other German rocket experts were captured and went to work in the United States or Soviet Union or the United Kingdom or France. Stölzl, on the other hand, headed for the hills. He hid out in Switzerland. He didn't work for any of the Allied governments. And he was free to say anything he wanted and to write up anything he wanted. And so here after the war, August 1945, he was making these blueprints that seemed to be related to his wartime work. And these blueprints show an A9 or an A4B with wings, but with some peculiar features. This thing is 18 meters long instead of the usual 14. So it is the stretched limo version, but it's also piloted. In fact, it has two pilots here, highly, highly unusual. So two pilots here. And one might think, well, maybe these are just the sci-fi speculations of an unemployed rocket scientist after the war. But then in digging through the US National Archives at College Park, I found some other documents. So these are from just before the end of the war, when US Army forces were invading, taking over Thuringia, exactly where Stölzl had been stationed. And so these are memos written here in the final month of the war in real time as the US is coming into this area. And they describe a massive underground factory at a location. Again, this is not Nordhausen. These coordinates do not match Nordhausen, but they do line up with where Stölzl was employed. Factory employs 20 to 30,000 people, foreign workers, including a lot of French. They are making the V4, which is a two-man rocket of some sort. And this other note from the same incident says gadget holds two men. So it's designed to launch two men, exactly like we saw in Stölzl's drawing. Partial assembly, it's being mass produced at this factory, and then partial assembly here, and then it's being sent to Weimar, to another factory, for final assembly with other components. More information later after complete interrogation. So this was 8th of April, 1945. 10 days later, in the Paris newspapers, articles start showing up. Again, a lot of the workers here had been French. They'd been freed when the Americans came along. And so 10 days later, some of them have gotten back to Paris. They told their story. And this describes exactly the same thing, a massive underground factory employing thousands of French and other foreign workers, building the V4 super rocket. And then finally, here is a memo I found in Air Force archives. And this is from June 1945, just before this whole area was handed over to Soviet control during the Cold War, and says, yes, indeed, there is a large underground rocket factory right at this location, but no further information on it. So of course, there would have been further information. There would have been detailed site inspection reports. There would have been detailed interrogations, as they say here they will conduct. They would have had interrogations of these workers, of German scientists, and yet none of that information has been released, at least as far as I'm aware. So where are all of these reports? But this actually appears to be real. And let's stop and think about the implications of this for a moment. And we're talking about during the war, so early 1940s, the Germans are producing rockets designed to launch 2 people into space. And they've not merely designed them, they've built them. And they've not merely built them, they're mass producing them at a facility with 20 to 30,000 workers. And that's not the only facility. There's another facility at Weimar that they're also working with, possibly others. So there's a large German industry mass producing rockets to launch 2 people at a time into space. This is something that would not happen again until the 1960s in the space race. So this is fully 2 decades ahead of its time. It's amazing work, and most of it has never been released to the public before. The A9 could be launched by itself, or it could be launched on top of a booster called the A10, a larger rocket. And with the A10 boost, the A9 would have enough range to go all the way from Europe to the United States. Officially, the A10 was just a paper drawing. Officially, it was never built. Read all the history books, that's exactly what they say. But I will show you some interesting evidence that may indicate otherwise. There was an even larger rocket. So after the war, when Brown came to work in the United States, he was chatting up some reporters in December 1946, and he said, oh yeah, during the war, we were developing this rocket that would deliver a 6-ton payload to the United States across the Atlantic. Now, even the A9-A10 could not deliver a 6-ton payload. Its maximum was 1 to 2 tons. So this would be a different rocket. Von Braun clearly had a specific design in mind, something specific he was working on. He doesn't say what it was. The best match I'm aware of would be something called the A11, even larger than an A10. But he clearly desperately wanted to deliver a 6-ton bomb to the United States. And we know from other documents that Germany was developing a 6-ton hydrogen bomb. Then there were other large rockets as well. These are being developed in Bohemia, in the Czech Republic, what's now the Czech Republic. So from Time magazine, November 1945, says retreating Germans left behind fuselages, fins, and other parts of V-bombs. In safes, there were plans for the V4, said to be a giant radio-controlled rocket capable of being fired from Prague to the Americas. And they also left lots of nuclear components as well, suggesting they intended to develop a nuclear warhead. From the same time, 1946, this is a report from US intelligence after having visited this facility. And this Czech facility fell under Soviet control. So it was very difficult for a US observer to go visit. But he actually managed to get in and visit and said, yes, they had completed the V4. He saw the completed V4 rocket at this facility in Bohemia. He talked to the German scientists who'd been involved in developing it and were now going to turn it over to the Russians. And he tried to talk to them more, but he was prohibited by the security services. Here is another post-war intelligence report that V3 and V4 models built during the war are presumed to still be there, including all data still at this Czech plant. A final report that at least one of the prototype V4 rockets had been taken from Czech territory back to Russia. And they'd taken the rocket, which had several features. It had considerably increased range over the A4, this reports, consistent with being able to go all the way from Prague to the Americas.
but it also says this nose had a new and more powerful charge. Now, the standard A4 used conventional explosives. There's only so far you can go with those. So if you really want a new and more powerful charge, it suggests that the warhead may have been nuclear. Germans certainly had big plans for these rockets. This is another document from the estate of Heinz Stölzel. In addition to drawing his rockets, he drew their planned trajectories. This shows the suborbital trajectory and the atmospheric reentry trajectory for his rockets. And from the Deutsches Museum Archive, here is a drawing showing exactly where they plan to land. So lower Manhattan right here, with the zone of damage all the way out to the rest of New York and parts of New Jersey here. So clearly they had very specific ideas when you care enough to send the very best. So were the rockets actually built? There's a lot of evidence from a lot of people in positions to know that these rockets were actually built. They all say they were built. They all say exactly the same thing. So German officials who are highly placed say that the large rockets were built. Here is Henry Picker, who liked to hang out with Hitler and copy down information from Hitler's inner conversations. And he says up to early 1945, Hitler wanted the A9 long-range rocket intended against the USA to be ready for series production and completely operational. He hoped that the intercontinental rocket would make the US amenable to peace, and especially if he could have equipped it with the uranium bomb. This is from Otto Skorzeny, a highly placed commando, again, like to chat up Hitler. And he says that, talk from Hitler and people around him was about a terrible weapon that was supposed to be based on artificially produced radioactivity, so nuclear bomb, designed to be launched on a rocket. Included in the VU weapons program was the construction of a rocket capable of bombarding New York or Moscow. This rocket was practically finished at the end of March 1945. Prototypes were finished in March 1945 and could have gone into series production, mass production in July 1945 if the war continued. And this is from Werner Grothmann, Heinrich Himmler's adjutant. The giant rocket intended for America had just been built in Thuringia shortly before the end of the war. They were building prototypes for flight tests, and they were planning mass production. And once they had mass-produced versions of these, then they planned to start launching them all at the United States in October 45. And when the war ended before that, he reports that there were some hotheads, presumably meaning Hitler, who wanted to go ahead and launch the prototype rockets with the prototype nuclear bombs. So all these folks are telling the same story. These large rockets were built. They were designed to be armed with nuclear weapons. But then, clearly that did not happen before the end of the war. So it's a huge unanswered question. We just don't have the documents to answer exactly what happened, exactly how far they got. If they were stopped, did they simply run out of time? Did we send in George Peppard to stop them? It's unclear exactly what happened, how far it got. From the Allied side, here is supporting information. So wartime Allied intelligence. This is from early 1943, so over 2 years before the end of the war. And it says that Allied investigation quickly disclosed that there was a large group of German technicians in the German army experimenting with very large conventional types of rockets with a total weight in the neighborhood of 68 tons. Now, the standard A4 or V2 weighed only 14 tons. So this is much larger than a V2. And this US intelligence document says that it's not a paper design, they were experimenting with it in early 1943, and that it's so clear from the evidence that they're experimenting with it that Allied investigation quickly disclosed this. No question about it, it's clear. They have these large rockets, they're experimenting with them even 2 years before the end of the war. Here is another Air Force document. This is an interrogation of a prisoner of war who had seen some stuff before he was captured. So in 1944, he had visited an underground facility in southern Germany, in Friedrichshafen, and he reported that V2 using kind of the generic term here, V2 was being made there, and that the V2 was so large it took 3 railroad cars to haul every V2 out of the factory. Now, a standard V2 or A4 could be carried on 1 railroad car. So again, this is something much larger than a standard rocket, and it was being mass produced at this underground factory in 1944, according to this Air Force intelligence. Here is another document. This is from the beginning of 1945, January 1945, very high-level briefing document at the very top of the US Army Air Force, describing the present status of known German weapons. And they say that larger rockets, rockets larger than the A4 or V2, are known to exist, 68 feet in length. So this is not at all the standard A4. So all these folks are telling exactly the same story. These large rockets were built. Same thing goes for Allied political leaders. Here's Winston Churchill just after the war ended in Europe, when the Americans captured vast stores of rockets of all kinds near Leipzig. Once we had all the information, and once we examined all the emplacements for launching them from France and Holland, then it became clear just how much peril there had been from all these. Only just in time did the Allied armies blast the Viper in his nest, Winston Churchill being Winston Churchill. Otherwise, the autumn of 1944, to say nothing of 1945, might well have seen London as shattered as Berlin. So Churchill, from what he had seen, what had been reported to him, was certainly convinced of the reality of these things. This is US Senator Thomas, and he is describing things he has seen during his tours and have been reported to him. About a dozen new V weapons were on drawing boards and in laboratories, much more than just paper documents, and nearing production. One would carry people in a pressurized cabin. That's exactly what we've seen, the 2-man rocket in a pressurized cabin. Another would be launched from a submarine. We'll talk more about those next time, capable of crossing the Atlantic to deliver a weapon to New York. And it wasn't impractical. Germans' prediction was they were able to do this very soon. Rockets more deadly than the V2 would have reached all important cities of England. We couldn't have prevented it. Just before VE Day, I personally visited a V weapons factory. So he saw all this stuff with his own eyes. And he says that we were just in time. And here's Senator Harry Byrd, another US Senator, reporting exactly the same thing. Almost ready was a V2, again in the generic sense, of a much greater range. I personally saw the progress they made on the Super V2 type, rocket-powered, capable of crossing the Atlantic to New York. So this would be the full A9, A10. He says he saw this with his own eyes. It was nearly ready. So everybody's telling exactly the same story, which disagrees with what is written in the history books, that this was purely a paper project. Same thing from Allied military leaders. Here's General Karl Spaatz. So December 1945, the Germans were readying a transatlantic model when the war ended. This is from General Henry Arnold in the Army Air Force. The A-10, a very large rocket intended especially for New York, was being built, not a paper model, being built. Here is another document from NARA, and says mass production of V2, again in the generic sense, capable of a range of 3,000 miles, was within reach of German scientists at the close of the war. And from Colonel Donald Putt, Putt is quite an interesting figure. He was a colonel during the war. He became an Air Force general after the war. He was one of the main people charged with rounding up German scientists at the end of the war and bringing them back to the United States and employing them and finding out everything that they knew. So we can take very seriously information from Donald Putt. So he says here that yes, the Germans were readying rocket surprises for the whole world in general, and England in particular, much more than just the A4 rocket. More information, these rockets were intended to be armed with a nuclear warhead. So once the Allies were in France in 1944, September, they reported discovering evidence of rockets armed with a warhead with an explosive radius of 3 kilometers. So clearly something nuclear. This is Colonel George Woods. During the war, he was in Air Force intelligence. After the war, he became assistant to the Undersecretary of the Air Force, so highly placed. He wrote after the war that, oh yeah, everybody knew, at least all his intelligence buddies knew, that Germany was developing the A9 with an atomic bomb. It is well known that the Germans originally had hoped to have all this completed by the end of 1944. More information from Donald Putt here in the Army Air Force's official publication. It is now fairly well known that Germans were building large rockets, trying to equip them with atomic bombs, and we still don't know exactly how close they came before the end of the war. So all these people were not just kind of speaking off the top of their heads, making stuff up. They're all saying exactly the same story based on what they've seen on the ground and people they've talked to. There must be reports, and yet the official reports on this stuff have never been released. Where are those reports in archives? More information from Allied military leaders. This is from the CIOS committee. So the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee was investigating all these German technologies. And this was a joint final report from the US and British heads of this very powerful CIOS committee, just summarizing some of their greatest hits, some of the most impressive things they've discovered. And they say, oh yeah, there was a latest model built of the A9, which was capable of a range of 2,400 miles, which would require the A-10 booster to be with it. So the A-10 booster was apparently built as well, at least according to this. And it's a fact that there were radio-controlled models capable of an accuracy plus or minus 150 feet. So very, very accurate compared to the much cruder A4 used earlier in the war, which had relatively poor accuracy. And this passage, experiments had already been conducted on piloted models. So you've seen the plans for the piloted model of the A9. You've seen the US Army's reports that the piloted models were being mass produced. These people, after investigating for a while after the war, these highly placed people are saying that experiments had been conducted on piloted models. Yeah, they launched the piloted models. Now, if you launch a piloted model without a pilot, it's not a piloted model. So they may have actually launched pilots with these things. Again, imagine this, launching essentially astronauts in 1945, a couple of decades before the space program that we know. And the same report says that, oh yes, they were intending to equip these rockets with nuclear warheads. So this is just the summary final report. It mentions this, it mentions lots of other stuff. We have full reports on the other details mentioned in this summary report, but we don't have any full CIOS report on these advanced rockets that are nuclear armed. So where are those reports in archives now? This is further evidence. This is from US Air Force General William Richardson. And after the war, he blabbed to the press and said, oh yeah, at the end of the war, they're developing these large rockets, nuclear armed. Yeah. But again, where are the reports? In addition to the site visits, all those people seem to have visited sites and reporting what they'd seen with their own eyes. There'd be interrogation reports, interrogations of the captive foreign workers like the French workers, but interrogations also of the German experts developing this stuff. And one of those would be Hans Kammler, who was the top SS general on all of these programs. Officially, he died in May 1945. As I mentioned in one of our earlier programs, here is a document showing that he was captured alive by the US and was still being interrogated as of 6 months after the war. So Kammler could have revealed a lot of details in his post-war interrogations about these rocket programs, as well as the nuclear program. For example, here is a document that Kammler had signed off on during the war. These are train logs recording shipments to and from Kammler. This is all very high priority material. A lot of it appears to be nuclear. But one of the line items here that Kammler signs off on is the delivery of 18-meter machines, very high priority 18-meter machines. What machine would be 18 meters long, thin enough to go on a train, high priority, and associated with nuclear stuff? Quite possibly one of these stretched limo versions of an A4, one of these 18-meter A4s. But again, where are the reports? There would be extensive reports on the post-war interrogations of Kammler. Those have never been released. Speaking of other interrogations, probably all of the German scientists involved in these programs would have been interrogated extensively after the war. We have virtually no interrogation reports on them. In particular, we have almost nothing on von Braun, the guy who would have known the most. So here is von Braun with a group of other German rocket experts after they'd come to the US. This is the famous paperclip program, and all these people have a paperclip file at the National Archives. So here's an index of the various paperclip files National Archives has, except Werner von Braun has no paperclip file. His brother, Magnus von Braun, has a paperclip file, and lots of other folks have one, but Werner von Braun does not have a paperclip file. Now, he was important enough that, of course, he would have had a paperclip file, just like everybody else. They didn't overlook him. So he must have a paperclip file. There must be all kinds of juicy stuff in that, and yet it's not been delivered to the National Archives. So where is that paperclip file, and why can't we read it? What is in it? Here are other reports that we don't have. This is a cover letter from June 1946, year after the war, written in the US Army Air Forces. It says that they've gotten 2 captured German rocket experts to write up a report about all the large-sized German rockets and applications. This is the cover letter, but the actual report that goes with the cover letter just happens to be missing. Nobody has seen this in the archive. So where is this report? Or here is a card catalog from the National Archives at College Park. And it's a card catalog of reports that should be on file. And these are reports of large German rockets, in particular one here entitled The History of the German Transatlantic Rocket A-10. So if the A-10 was only a paper design, never got beyond a simple paper sketch, why was there a whole history? Why did somebody write up the entire history of it? Why was that history written 2 years after the war by the Central Intelligence Group, the predecessor of the CIA? Why was it classified top secret? Why is it still classified secret and unavailable to us, withheld from us? And why is it filed with atomic energy, nuclear physics uses that suggest that this rocket was carrying a nuclear payload? So again, where are all these reports? We know that they exist. We can show that they exist. Why have they not been released? What do they contain? What we do know is that there was a large transfer of all that technology to the US and to other countries. So Werner von Braun and all of his hundreds of buddies formed the core of US military and civilian rocket and missile programs after the war, all the way up to the Saturn V. Likewise, German experts were central for the Soviet-Russian rocket programs. Even the Soyuz that is flying now is directly based on designs, overall designs from a team led by Helmut Gottrup, and with engines from a team led by Werner Baum. So it's all directly German designed material. In the UK, they captured their own German rocket scientists, put them to work, and no Moonraker happened. But they did develop their own rockets in the UK, at least until they got cheap and canceled the program. And the French had a lot of captured German scientists, put them to work, and that led all the way to the modern Ariane launch vehicle nowadays. So we can see the technology transfer process that happened with this. So that's liquid propellant missiles and rockets. Let's talk about liquid propellant space planes, essentially space shuttles. The earliest one that we're aware of was called Silbervogel, or Silverbird, and it was designed as a suborbital bomber. This was an active program that ran for at least 12 years before the war ended. It was headed by the Austrian Eugen Zinger and his wife, Erna Brett, and they designed what is essentially a mini space shuttle. It had one pilot. It was designed to drop a bomb on the city of your choice. And they did detailed calculations of their mini space shuttle and of suborbital trajectories for it, atmospheric reentry trajectories. It was designed to be launched on a rocket sled. So to give it more velocity taking off, it would go up a very long ramp, a track with a rocket-powered sled, boosting the vehicle up to at least Mach 1 before it took off using its own engines. And if you've seen old sci-fi movies like When Worlds Collide, they'll show you this kind of thing. It's all based on Zilbervogel. So officially, this was just a paper project, but their paper project had some interesting parameters. They were specifically trying to deliver a 6-ton payload to New York. What could that 6-ton payload be? The German hydrogen bomb weighed 6 tons. According to the history books, this was never built, never got beyond paper, but there is some evidence that it did, in fact, get built. So here is from the reliable Donald Putt, again, from the US Air Force. Again, he'd rounded up all kinds of German scientists and information, so he knew what he was talking about. And a year or two after the war ended, he said, oh yeah, a test model of the Zilbervogel was built, a prototype that carried 1 man and had landing gear. We actually don't know if they did a test flight of it. Maybe they did a test flight. What we do know is that test runs were made with the engine. We know that the engine was built. This is a photo from the Deutsches Museum in Munich showing construction of the Zilbervogel rocket engine, 100-ton thrust, very massive rocket engine for its time, being built in 1941. So 4 years before the end of the war, they would have had ample time to complete the rest of it. And here is a report from 1944. After the Allies invaded France, they found that Germans had been building very large launch ramps for these things, just the sort of launch ramp I described that a Zilbervogel would need in order to take off. And moreover, the German engineers had warned people, when we launch this thing, make sure you stay at least 6 miles away. So if things went wrong, if the bomb blew up as they were launching, then the bomb would have a blast radius of 6 miles or 10 kilometers. And that corresponds to the megaton range. So again, we're back to the German H-bomb, the 6-ton bomb. So where are the reports on this? You know, we have these interesting accounts in the popular press. We have this interesting photo. There must be detailed reports in archives, but where are they? And then after the war, this technology was transferred, just like the rockets. And here were a couple of key people involved in the transfer. One was Walter Dornberger, Werner von Braun's buddy from Peenemünde. And so after the war, he designed and built all kinds of versions based on Zilbervogel, something called BOMI that was designed but not built. The X-15, of course, was built and used quite successfully. They built, but then canceled before they launched it, the X-20 Dinosaur, which would have been the first US space shuttle, canceled in 1963. Here's Hans Multop. So he came to work for the United States after the war and designed the X-24 lifting body. So if you've ever seen the $6 Million Man, think about the opening of that show, where they show one of these things trying to land. And so this was designed based on Zilbervogel. Then all those technologies were used in the US space shuttle proper. Werner von Braun started arguing for a space shuttle as early as 1952 in the United States. Walter Dornberger was the one who actually dubbed it the space shuttle. He gave the name. The space shuttle incorporated all the technologies that had been developed for these earlier programs, both in Germany and German programs in the post-war United States, from Dinosaur and the A9 and so forth. Another German scientist, Olaf Busemann, was the one who proposed the ceramic tiles for the thermal insulation to insulate the space shuttle on reentry, and proposed some of the specific shapes for it, aerodynamic shapes. Kraft Ehricke was another scientist deeply involved in all these post-war rocket plans based on his wartime work. the main engines of the space shuttle came specifically from several German rocket engine designers. And the solid rocket boosters on the sides used solid propellant technology that had been developed by German scientists, as we'll discuss next. So final bit here for today on the land launch missiles is solid propellant missiles as opposed to liquid propellants. And of course, solid propellants for rockets go way back to ancient China. But during World War II, the Germans took those conventional solid propellants and pushed them as far as they could in developing things like one of the very first surface-to-air missiles, the Rheintochter here in 1943, and this four-stage solid propellant rocket, the Rheinbote, also in 1943, range of 200 kilometers. So very impressive technologies, but these were about the most that you could do with the conventional pre-existing rocket propellants. So people needed better solid rocket propellants, and German scientists developed that. Nowadays, we call this newer type of propellant ammonium perchlorate composite propellant. During the war, the Germans called it Perpulver. Per for perchlorate and pulver means powder. But this was fully modern solid rocket propellant, widely used in lots of rockets nowadays, but developed during the war, in particular by Hermann Teichmann, but also Rolf Engel, Uwe Buttevant, and Hermann Wüllers. So they developed all the major features of these advanced solid propellant rockets. They demonstrated that these work in small working solid propellant rockets. They may have built larger ones. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then after the war, they were captured and transferred this technology to other countries, including the United States. This mentions here interrogations by the United States of Dr. Teichmann. Here is something that they were working on during the war that was much larger than a small test rocket. There are documents from these interrogations reporting that they were working on what they called the V101. And the V101 used their new solid propellant, but it used it for a rocket with a total weight of 140 tons and designed for a very long range of thousands of kilometers. So this would have been a solid propellant ICBM. And then after this, it just goes dark. It's not clear what further interrogations happened. It's not clear how far they got during the war. Maybe it was only a paper design, but there must be more information still buried in archives. We do know that that information was transferred, though, to the United States and other countries. And that information was transferred from experts like Dr. Teichmann here. And it was transferred by other German-speaking experts like Fritz Zwicky. Zwicky was Swiss. He'd worked in the German-speaking research world for a while. Was educated there, came to the US before the war, and he ended up working for Caltech and the War Department and Aerojet Company as their research director. And all of these were involved in wartime and post-war production of solid propellant rockets in the United States. So here is a document saying that, oh yeah, Fritz Zwicky is very eager to interrogate Hermann Teichmann to find out all the latest details about his solid propellants. So this seems to have been transferred to the US this way. The information was transferred. Teichmann himself went to the French and was probably one of the main reasons that French rockets were so advanced after the war. But other German and Austrian experts came to the US, in particular, Karl Klager came to Aerojet, Fritz Zwicky's company. Karl Klager was an expert on both solid and liquid propellant rockets. He's not famous, so you always hear about Werner von Braun, you don't hear about him. But if you start looking at patents, you'll see he was all over the place. So he was highly, highly integral to these post-war rockets in the United States. So all that was German technology developed during the war, transferred with German scientists, by German scientists to the United States after the war, and then went in to the first large US solid propellant rockets after the war, like the US Navy's Polaris, the Army's Pershing, the Air Force Minuteman. All these things used that technology. So we always think about liquid propellant rockets being developed and transferred by Vannevar and Brown. And people in the history books will say, oh, solids were developed by the United States by itself after the war. But no, here we can see exactly which Germans developed it and how it was all transferred. So I will end there on a cliffhanger unless the box office warrants a sequel. And next time we'll talk about the other two sides of the triad, the sub-launched missiles and the intercontinental jet bombers. If anybody's interested, or if anybody has trouble sleeping, you can go to my website and download for free my book. It's nearly 5,000 pages, of which over 1,000 pages covers these German programs to develop weapons of mass destruction and the vehicles to deliver them. In particular, if you're looking for the vehicles, go to chapter 9 on aerospace engineering for a shorter overview of some of the things I've described. And then if you really can't sleep, go to Appendix E for about 800 pages or so of all the primary source archival documents that I've shown on this. And again, it's all free on my website.
Very good. Thank you, Todd. Surely do appreciate that. And yes, we want to continue this theme, and we appreciate all of the research that you've done and the presentation you made today.
Oh, thank you.
All right. So, folks, we will be back again. I think we're scheduled for the 24th to do the next session, Todd. So if you'll plan on that for us, we'll continue this story at that time. Okay?
All right. Thank you very much.
Very good. Folks, thanks for joining us today. And I'm hopeful that Keith will be back with us on the next time, and that the sickness at his home will be short-lived and everybody will be all right. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, Hidden Histories, the stories of the Secret City.
And welcome to this edition of Hidden History Stories from the Secret City. I'm Keith McDaniel, along with my co-host, Ray Smith. Good afternoon, Ray.
Hello, Keith. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. And we have got a guest with us that we've had on a few times before. And
We have.
I'm going to let you introduce him, Ray.
Yeah, I'll be glad to. We've got Dr. Todd Rider with us again today. Todd has brought us a number of insights into the German nuclear program, and he's going to continue that theme today. But I think it's been most interesting for us to be able to look at his research and to look at what was actually going on, not only what was happening during the war, but he's also showed us that some of the things that we have not really known where they came from actually had their origin with those Germans and with those forgotten creators that he's brought us as we've had our series up to now. So, Todd, we'll let you take over and bring us the next segment of the forgotten creators of the German nuclear triad.
Well, thank you both for inviting me back. I apologize for being a recidivist. And as usual, let me acknowledge all the people and all the archives that helped in finding the evidence I'll show you. It was not just my work, but a lot of people, a lot of places worked to uncover all this evidence. And on the last exciting episode of our show, we talked about how during the war, Germany had been developing nuclear bombs, and they'd also been developing the means to deliver those bombs. Now, during the Cold War era, we think about the nuclear triad as being 3 different methods to deliver nuclear weapons, 3 different methods developed by the US and the Soviet Union. And what I can show is that the entire nuclear triad actually had its origins in Germany during World War II. All 3 types of methods were being used, were under development to deliver German nuclear weapons to Allied targets. So we've talked about the nuclear payloads. They came in small, medium, and supersized. Last time we talked about the land-launched intercontinental missiles, 1 if by land. This time it's 2 if by sea and 3 if by airmail. So we'll cover these, starting with submarine-launched cruise missiles. Now, everybody's familiar with the wartime German V-1 missile. It was essentially the world's first cruise missile, at least the first fully operational cruise missile. It first flew in 1942, and here were some of the German creators of this. It was essentially a small pilotless jet plane with a bomb on board, and it required a running start to get off. So it was launched from catapults, generally on the European coast toward England. What people are less familiar with, though, are the modifications, the improvements of the V1. And so here is a declassified post-war investigation by the Allies of advanced V1s found in archives. And it says 2 further developments of the V1 program were an attempt to launch the missile from the ramp of a submarine, the deck of a submarine, and a project for a piloted V1. In the first case, the ramp was constructed on the submarine. It's believed this was intended for attacks against coastal towns and defenses on the eastern seaboard of the USA. In the second instance, the piloted V2, it's known that several models were constructed. It was intended that the pilot should fly the missile to within a short range of the target, set the controls, and then jump out. And here you see one of these piloted V1s that was captured. And these things were actually test flown by German test pilots, like the famous Hanne Reich during the war. So in theory, the pilot could bail out in time before hitting the target. In practice, this was probably a suicide mission for the pilot. I'm not sure what the German word for kamikaze is, but I'm sure it's much longer. And anyway, so they had piloted versions. They had versions that could be launched on submarines. I will show you those in a moment. And they had versions that could be carried under the wing of larger aircraft and then air-launched, an air-launched cruise missile. Of course, nowadays we have the Alcom air-launched cruise missile. So they had all 3 of these versions. They also had nuclear armed versions that they were at least working on. Here is another declassified post-war Allied report. This was from an interrogation of Edmund Zorg, who was highly placed in this program. The British got him, were interrogating him after the war. This is in British archives. And he describes an improved manned V1 with atomic energy as a charge. In short, a manned controllable atomic bomb, which can be certainly released by modern, fast, large airplanes close to its target. That would ensure a safe destruction of the target, given that it is in the hands of a pilot ready to sacrifice himself. So the pilot rides the atomic bomb down just like Slim Pickens. So this was interesting. This was apparently much more than merely a paper idea. Previously, I've mentioned Hans Kammler. He was the SS general in charge of all these programs. At the end of the war, he was captured and secretly interrogated by the United States. This was one of the last things he sent before he surrendered to the Americans. So late April, he sent this telegram to his subordinate saying it was extremely urgent that they immediately blow up the V1 devices near Berlin. So destroy all the evidence, destroy all the evidence. Now, V1s, normal V1s were a dime a dozen. So there was something very, very unique, very interesting about these particular V1s that he wanted destroyed. So where are all the reports on there? So there must be all kinds of Allied and even captured Axis reports on this, certainly interrogation reports on Hans Kammler. Where are all these reports? They're still missing. They're still withheld from the public. I gave a document that described a sub-launched V1. Here's another document, and this is from the FDR Presidential Library. It says that photographs were taken in September 1944, so well before the end of the war. Photographs were taken of a submarine that was apparently designed to launch V1 missiles. So they had photographs. This was a drawing taken from the photograph to clarify it, but they actually had photographs. It'd be possible to launch a missile from the submarines. And so from the FDR library, the entire Roosevelt administration, top people in the US were deeply concerned that Germany apparently had developed the means to launch V1 missiles from submarines and intended to launch those against the United States. So this was September 44, and throughout late 1944 into early 1945, you see all kinds of now declassified high-level telegrams and cables from people, everybody from Dwight Eisenhower to J. Edgar Hoover, talking about detailed evidence for these sub-launch missiles. So from Eisenhower, U-boat will be leaving European waters shortly to launch V1s against New York. From other generals, reliable information, German U-boats are equipped with bomb launching platform. 4 U-boats were to be used in operation against New York. Even reports that a U-boat had actually attempted to launch missiles against New York, and either that failed or was somehow defeated by the Allies. So these reports continue into early 1945. Submarines would proceed within 100 to 200 miles of the United States and then fire these rockets. Here is from the US Admiral in charge of the whole Atlantic Fleet, saying that it's not only possible but probable that these things are being developed, will be used against the United States. So from very, very high level sources, they're all saying exactly the same thing, and yet we don't have the corresponding reports. Where are the reports for all of this? Now, after the war, immediately after the war, the United States did a PR tour for Parade magazine and everybody else, saying, look at this great new weapon the United States just developed after the war. This great new US developed weapon was a sub-launched cruise missile that just happened to look exactly like a V1 and just happened to be launched from the top of a submarine, exactly as described in those German documents. Very, very interesting. So this, proudly, purely USA developed weapon, if you lift up the rug, look underneath the rug, you start finding Germans and Austrians everywhere. So here were the people actually working on this program, Nazi weapon experts, former German scientists, here. And indeed, after the war, these experts went on to develop not just that, but further and further improved versions of cruise missiles, ultimately through the more modern types of cruise missiles we have now. Let's also talk about sub-launched ballistic missiles. And we really think of these as, post-war, Cold War US and Soviet inventions. But here are pictures from May 1942, 3 years before the end of the war. This is a German sub. It is launching ballistic missiles from underwater. Now, these are small ballistic missiles, but they are ballistic missiles. They're being launched from the sub as it's submerged. And so once this was successful in 1942, the Germans started trying to see if they could launch larger and larger and larger missiles from a sub. They built larger and larger versions. And most of the later tests were conducted not on the coast due to concerns about Allied bombing, but rather actually at a very deep lake in Austria. And all this was found by the US after the war. So the sub-launched ballistic missiles kept getting larger and larger until they actually worked their way all the way up to the V2 or the A4. Now this missile is larger than a submarine, so they had to be very creative in how they would carry this. And their idea was that a submarine would tow a trailer, a submersible trailer, and this trailer would cross the Atlantic following the submarine, riding horizontally. And then once they got off the coast of the United States, then they would stop. They would flood water into one end of this trailer, causing it to sink down, open up the doors, and they had a perfect launch platform for an A4 or V2 rocket. Now, again, people like to think of this as a paper design. It's reasonably well known in the books as a paper design, but this is from the actual German U-boat museum now. They say at the turn of 1944 to 1945, successful towing trials were actually executed using this. So they not only designed this, they built it, and then not only built it, they towed it around with submarines to make sure it would work. But where are the actual reports on these things? They've all vanished from the archives. In addition to the missiles, the submarine technology itself advanced greatly. The main U-boat people associated with Germany during the war was the so-called Type 7 U-boat. This was actually leftover German World War I technology. It was so advanced, decades ahead of its time, it was still useful in World War II. But the new subs they developed during World War II were much more advanced. They included the so-called Type 21 U-boat, which could stay submerged for a long time. And these captured Type 21s became the basis for post-war Soviet and US subs. And the Germans also developed very high-speed submarines, so high speed they needed a rounded nose, like modern post-war submarines. They developed sonar as well. Sonar was invented by Alexander Baim in 1912, and then through the 19-teens, 1920s, 1930s, developed into very sophisticated sonar systems at several different German companies. Once the Allies got sonar, the Germans were very concerned about that, and so they developed anti-sonar. They developed stealth submarines. This is a 1943 photo of a stealth submarine coated with special rubber tiles to absorb the sonar pings. Then after the war, all the stuff was captured, brought to the United States, as well as other countries. Again, we like to think of these ballistic missile programs in the United States as being purely US inventions, but lift up the rug, and there are Germans and Austrians everywhere. So here is Willy Fiedler, proud inventor of many of the key technologies for the Polaris sub-launch missile, the first US sub-launch missile. His name is plastered all over these patents. We've already mentioned previously Karl Klager, who invented the propellant for these missiles, as well as propellant for many, many other post-war US missiles and rockets. And that's just starting. So there's all kinds of Germans and Austrians just everywhere throughout these programs. So these technologies were developed during the war in Germany and Austria, and then transferred after the war. The same is true for other countries. So if you look at the Soviet Union, their first sub-launch missile was launched a decade after World War II, so in 1955. And their first sub-launch missile just happened to look almost exactly like a German Wasserfall missile, a wartime missile, essentially a half-size V2 or A4 rocket. So here's the German version from 1944. Here's the Soviet version from 1955. They're essentially identical, except for small differences in the fins to make this sub-launched instead of ground-launched. It was launched even from a Soviet submarine that had been directly based on the captured German Type 21 U-boat technology. So all this post-war technology came from wartime German creators, including many of those German experts who then went to these countries and were probably developing this in captivity in the Soviet Union. It also raises the question, though, that if German experts could use a German missile and launch it from a German-based submarine in the Soviet Union after the war, could they have done this during the war? So this may suggest that there were other wartime programs to do this. There were other advancements associated with submarines. So, of course, it's hard to send radio signals to a submarine. The water absorbs the electromagnetic waves. But if the frequency of the waves is really, really low, then you can actually get the waves to pass through water and through the Earth itself. And the best known example is the US Navy facility that was built at Clam Lake in 1980s. And so this transmitted extremely long wavelength waves through the ground and through the ocean so that the US government could communicate with their missile submarines around the world. Well, here it is, built, brand new technology in the 1980s. Here it is built in 1943, not just built, but operational. It was called Goliath, and this was the technology fully operational in Germany during the war, so they could communicate with their U-boats when they were underwater halfway around the world. The actual Goliath transmitter was seized by the Soviet Union and carried back to the Soviet Union and used there. So we've talked about land-launched intercontinental missiles. We've talked about submarine-launched missiles. The final component of the nuclear triad, as we know it, is intercontinental jet bombers. And of course, the early history of jet development in Germany is reasonably well known. Hans von Hahn, backed by Ernst Haeckel, aircraft designer, built the first turbojet engine in 1935. Together, they flew the first jet aircraft in 1939. And then during the war, many other German and Austrian experts, like these guys, developed fully polished jet engines. Those were installed on aircraft designed by many other experts. And so you had things like the Messerschmitt 262 twin-engine jet fighter that was first flown in 1942. So very, very advanced technology for its time. But the important thing is that after the war, all these folks, all their technology was scooped up by the United States and by other governments. And so they led to lots of post-war jet engines and post-war jet aircraft. What is somewhat less known is that there were less conventional aircraft designs in Germany during the war, in particular flying wings. And so the flying wing design here had very, very large wings, little or no tail surface area. And these were pursued particularly by the Horten brothers, two aerospace designers, but a number of other German aerospace experts as well. They actually built a fighter-size jet wing bomber and used that, demonstrated that during the war. We know from the history books that they designed larger versions, bombers to go between continents. Officially, those larger versions were simply paper designs, except there's suspicious evidence. This was a response to a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request. And it says that immediately after the war, a number of German experts found US officials and said, we will build an intercontinental jet bomber for you immediately in exchange for food. So we'll build jet bomber for food. And they described exactly what they were proposing to immediately build for the United States. It was a massive, massive flying wing jet bomber with 6 engines capable of going between continents. So 7,000 kilometer range and 14,000 kilometers round trip. And the fact that they were proposing to immediately begin building this strongly suggests that maybe they had lots of experience with this. Maybe they had been building these things during the war. So a massive flying wing powered by half a dozen advanced jet engines. You've already seen the air-launched cruise missiles capable of carrying a pilot and an atomic bomb that could be carried by an aircraft like this. Now, any resemblance of all this to the first Captain America film is purely coincidental, I'm sure. And then there's more evidence these things were actually built. Here's from the Chicago Daily Tribune. As Allies were invading, finding all this stuff, both bomber and fighter types had been produced with 1 to 6 engines. Later models were jet propelled, so actually produced. Here's from the New York Times. The Germans planned to bomb New York and other eastern cities. They were within months of doing this with a fleet of jet propelled planes. Prototypes were found. The Germans' New York bomber, a prototype, was found at an undisclosed location along with Dick Cheney. And it had 4 engines, 4 jet engines. So all this was found. But again, where are the reports? This is described, but we don't have the corresponding reports. Those are still withheld from the public. More reports. A lot of the stuff was associated with Norway. Germany controlled Norway throughout the war. And so here is a report from May 44, a year before the end of the war. And it says that the Luftwaffe is frantically building lots and lots of huge airfields in Norway. Now, why would they be doing that? It furthermore says that in addition to the airfields, they're setting up BMW there. Now, BMW was making the BMW 003 jet engine used by many of these jet aircraft. And they're setting up Heinkel there. And Heinkel was building a lot of these advanced aircraft. So this is a year before the end of the war. Immediately after the war, the Royal Air Force blabbed to the press. They said, oh yeah, at the end of the war in Norway, we were really surprised. We found these large airfields and they had 40 giant Heinkel bombers. And the people there told us that they'd been built for raids on New York. They were waiting for the permission to go bomb New York. And so all this was found, all this was revealed by the Royal Air Force, published in the US military's own Stars and Stripes, as well as the Washington Post, LA Times, all over the place. and then just vanished. We have no official reports on this. So where are all of the reports? Why are they being withheld? So that seems to have come from Heinkel. As I mentioned, Ernst Haeckel ran his own aircraft development company. He was a very famous designer. His top designer was named Siegfried Günther. And after the war, some of their papers were captured by the British. Here they are from British Archive, showing these flying wing type designs. Also, after the war, Siegfried Günther was interrogated by the Americans. We know that he was captured by the Americans. He was forced to sit down and write down everything he knew about these giant flying wing bombers. And then the Americans said, "Thank you very much," and took all of his reports and left. So where are all these reports? They're described, but we don't have these reports. And we have information from other sources. This was Henry Fowler. He was the director of the US Enemy Branch Foreign Economic Administration. He gave testimony before the US Senate after the war. And he said, oh yeah, it appears that if the Germans had been able to prolong the war by 6 months longer, then they would have been mass producing and smashing New York City and other US cities with improved V2 bombs, so long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as jet-propelled planes that could have reached Washington, so long-range intercontinental jet bombers. Here he admitted to the US Senate, yes, all this stuff was in development. Now, if it was being mass-produced, if they would have had large numbers of these 6 months after the war, they would at least have had prototypes by the end of the war. So where are the prototypes? And most importantly, where are the reports? Here's another report. This was from the Convair aircraft company that helped investigate all this stuff in Germany at the end of the war. And in Life magazine, immediately after the war, they said, yeah, just how slim the war was is known to military intelligence. They know all the stuff that Germany was developing. Some of these things cannot be revealed yet, but we talked to German rocket engineers, and the German rocket engineers said, oh yeah, we plan to destroy New York City and other American cities starting in November 1945, if the war continued. So these were clearly far more than just paper projects if they were this close to realization. This also says that the United States discovered prototypes of these intercontinental jet bombers after the war. So again, where are the prototypes? Where are the reports? Here's further information. This is from General Marshall himself. So after the war, he submitted an official report on the war and said that German technological advances, such as in the development of atomic explosives, made it imperative that we launch the invasion of Normandy when we did, before they could attack us with these terrible weapons. He also said that at the close of the war, that the factories in the United States, the eastern coast of the United States, was just on the outer fringes of the range of fire from an enemy in Europe. So there was technology that existed in Germany at the end of the war, capable of actually reaching the east coast of the United States. So where is that technology? Where are those prototypes? And where are the reports? There were other developments associated with the advanced aircraft, including radar. People like to think of radar as being something that was invented during World War II by the British and then improved by the Americans. And it was actually invented by the Germans in 1903, so long before World War II, even long before World War I. Invented in Germany. It was pursued at a number of companies in Germany, steadily advanced through the 1920s. Here's an improved high power radar. And then once the Allies got radar, the Germans decided they needed to develop anti-radar, stealth capabilities. So they developed radar absorbing coatings, special materials, special paints that could help to absorb radar waves, keep them from bouncing back to the Allies. And they also developed special aircraft designs, including the flying wing, and aircraft materials such as wood that would minimize the radar reflection. And again, all this was captured by the Allies. And so it appears that the post-war stealth technology was descended directly from this German wartime expertise. There are many more things we still need to learn. Much more research needs to be done on exactly how extensive this post-war influence was. So, for example, in post-war aircraft by the US and other countries, we know that there were a lot of captured German and Austrian experts and designs, people like Hans Multop, Alexander Lippisch. We know that their work was highly influential in the development of a number of aircraft. We need to find out a lot more. This was in the United States, but similar things happen in other countries. So in the United Kingdom, Dietrich Kuppmann and Johanna Weber in particular lent their expertise to things like the Vulcan bomber and the Concorde passenger jet, supersonic aircraft in the UK. But much more research needs to be done to find out just how much influence there was. So to sum up, we know from publicly available sources that so much of this technology was developed in Germany during the war and then transferred afterwards. We only have a small fraction of that documentation that is currently available to the public. Much of it remains unavailable, classified, buried, and really needs to be found. And so hopefully people can answer these questions of just how far German work in these various areas got during the war, and exactly how much that influenced and how it influenced post-war work in the United States and in other countries. And that's true for the nuclear payloads themselves. How far did German nuclear weapons progress? It's true for the land-launched missiles, the submarine-launched missiles, and the intercontinental jet bombers. So there's enough work here to keep an army of historians busy for decades. And I'm really hoping that there's some people out there who might be interested in this and would take this up and carry it much further than I and other people have. So if anybody's interested in doing that, a good place to start is my book. It's available at my website. You can download it for free. It has well over 1,000 pages of information on this stuff, primary sources that I found in archives, exact locations in the archives where it all came from, good places to start digging. For the aerospace delivery vehicles, you can look at Chapter 9 for the short version, or Appendix E for the long version if you're having insomnia. Again, it's available at my website. So this is for the aerospace delivery vehicles. For the weapons themselves, the short version is in section 8.8, and the full-fledged 1,000-page version is in Appendix D. So I will stop there.
Well, thank you, Todd. I'm amazed at the amount of information that you've been able to gather. Can you share with us where have you found the most useful sources of your information?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me pop back to my acknowledgments slide and I'll show you some of the archives. Really archives around the world, some yielded more information, more relevant information than others. In the United States, the National Archives are great. So College Park is the main one, but there are smaller ones in various other parts of the country. So for example, the Oak Ridge records are stored in Atlanta.
Yes.
But I spent several months digging through College Park, found all kinds of stuff. Some of these other people have also dug through College Park. The Air Force did not send their documents to College Park. Instead, they set up their own Air Force Historical Research Agency in Alabama. So I spent several weeks in Alabama in their room full of microfilm in summer with no air conditioning, trying to read as many microfilms as I could. But tons of information came from there. There are a few other good archives in the US, but those are really the biggies. And then in Europe, the UK has excellent archives. I found some stuff in Germany, found stuff all over the place.
Todd, how long have you been working on this for you to come up with this incredible document?
Thank you. I've been interested in these various topics for a long time. I'm a scientist by education and career, but I thought I could do better science if I studied how previous scientists had made their discoveries. So I've spent several decades reading about the history of science, trying to learn from what other scientists have done and how they did it. But I really got serious about writing this book, pulling things together in 2016. So I started writing and sending out portions of this in 2016, and then put all the Forgotten Creators online at the beginning of 2020.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's incredible.
Keith, I'm glad to say that as he's done this, I've been one of the people that he has sent sections to review, and I was just amazed when he first started. I thought that, you know, I've never heard of some of this stuff, most of it.
Yeah.
But he continued starting in 2016. And then when did you actually put the final version out?
Yes.
Not leaving yet, is it?
Yeah, it's a good point. So I began sending out portions of this to people like Ray and other people to comment on, to offer improvements on in 2016. And then at the beginning of 2020, I put all of it online, and I keep updating it. So as I keep finding new stuff, I keep adding to it. And it's currently just over 5,000 pages, just under 5,000 pages. I'm working on a new version that will probably be just over 5,000 pages. So that's a major life milestone for me.
That's an amazing achievement in 6 years.
Yeah.
An amazing achievement in 6 years. And yeah, so here begs the question. You said over and over again, where are the documents? Where's the proof? Okay. Why do you think that so much of this stuff, especially in the US, is being kept from the public? I mean, what is your gut hunch tell you?
Yeah, I mean, that really is one of the main unanswered questions. So from everything I've shown through these presentations, you can see that there's clearly a lot of stuff that exists and yet has not been released. I've shown you the yellow cards from the National Archives saying, we have this and you're not allowed to see it.
Yeah.
And I've shown you other things that must exist, interrogation reports and things, where we don't even have so much as a yellow card. So it's clear that a lot of stuff is being withheld. However, we don't have any evidence, we don't have any data on why it's being withheld. And all I can do is speculate. So, you know, purely speculation, might be right or wrong or half-baked. But you can easily imagine at the end of the war, at the end of World War II, the US, Soviet Union, other places were going into Germany, and they were all looking for a competitive advantage over the others. They all knew kind of the Cold War was coming. Or if not the Cold War, then industrial rivalry. They were all looking for pieces of German technology they could grab and experts they could grab. And then they would want to keep that as secret as possible from everyone else. So you don't let the Russians know about this. And a further advantage of that is that then you can actually brag, hey, look what we invented. Look how great our country is. We invented this all by ourselves after the war. And I've shown you examples of that. So for various reasons, this would have been classified immediately after the war. Of course, things having to do with advanced weapons technology, nuclear weapons designs and things would naturally be highly classified. So you can understand why it was classified then. Now, over time, there may simply be inertia. This stuff has been classified for so long, we'll just leave it classified. It's been buried for so long. Nobody wants to spend the time to go dig through the warehouse and find it, you know, right next to the Ark of the Covenant and bring it out of the warehouse and show people. So just bureaucratic inertia may be a good explanation for most of it. To the extent that, you know, modern governments are even aware that this still exists, there may be some sense of embarrassment, you know, embarrassed to admit that these things weren't quite invented where and by whom we thought they were. We're embarrassed to admit people like the SS General Hans Kammler were given shelter by the United States after the war and protection against the war crimes trials. or embarrassment in Germany or Austria about some of these wartime things. So it could be some sense of national embarrassment that's also keeping some of this withheld. But it's clear that there's a huge amount of information, and it's really scattered around the world. So the four major allied powers each grabbed a bunch of this. So the US, UK, France, Soviet Union, it's in all this corresponding archives, but other countries grab smaller amounts of this. I found information from as far away as Australia that was relevant to this. And of course, there's still some information still in Germany and Austria themselves. So my point in saying all this is I really encourage people to dig. I've only found the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole iceberg down there someplace. And if people are interested, they should go digging. They can find much more. And if you're not in the United States, dig where you are. So if you're in the Czech Republic, if you're in Australia, wherever you are, go dig through the archives you have. Or if you're in some of these areas in Europe where this work was being done, even consider doing industrial archaeology. These projects were developed at sites all over German-occupied Europe, and much of this stuff must still be buried in the ground. So it'd be possible to do industrial archaeology. Now, let me point out to anybody who considers that to be very, very careful. We don't know what's down there. And certainly we know that there were large amounts of nerve gas produced during the war. We know that Germans were very fond of booby trapping things at the end of the war with conventional explosives. So, don't hurt yourself by going digging, but anybody who's qualified, who has the expertise, has the capabilities, has the funding, has the legal permission, could go digging at some of these sites physically and answer some of these questions.
That when you were talking about these prototypes or these planes, whatever, that's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking it's in that warehouse next to the Ark of the Covenant, and that's where they keep all that stuff.
Yes.
So, but it is such a mystery. I mean, it is Indiana Jones-esque. This whole story about all of that. It's just It really is amazing.
Yeah, it is. It is hidden history that fits perfectly with your program.
Absolutely.
Yes, it surely is. And I would add that what you have done and are doing is not being done by many other people. It's a struggle. It's a lot of work. But let me ask you this. Have you found that using Freedom of Information request, you've been able to obtain information fairly readily?
A very small amount of what I show has come out through FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests. Almost everything was found just by digging in archives, things that had already been declassified.
I see.
In my experience, when people submit FOIA requests, they're very, very unlikely to get anything newly declassified back. Usually they will just dig through the archive and say, well, here's something that's already declassified, let's send you that. So you could have simply gotten that by going in person. Or occasionally they'll say, yeah, we have stuff, but we're not going to give it to you. So sometimes you do get that response back too. So a very small amount of my stuff has come from FOIA requests by various researchers, but the vast majority was me and a number of other researchers just brute force digging through the declassified archives for months and years at a time.
Yeah, and I do think that you're on to the rationale for why this information is not being released. I really liked your explanation, not just the inertia, the fact that no one's asking for it, but the insight that you have that there is embarrassment associated with it from various different sources makes it even more unlikely that it will become declassified. So what you've done to uncover information in already declassified sources, I think is very, very valuable to us. And we really do appreciate you taking the time and the effort to put these presentations together for us. And I think we're seeing that there's a significant amount of interest in what you're doing, and hopefully by putting this information out, we can generate even more interest for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, very good. Well, Ray, do we have anybody lined up for our next time?
Yes, we do. We have spoken with Dr. Judith Stauber of the Los Alamos Japan Institute.
Yeah.
And she's going to come and speak with us. And I think she's going to bring with her Clifton Truman Daniel,
Okay.
President Truman's grandson. We've had him on before, but they work together in relationships with Japan. And I think it'll make a very interesting discussion to have them. And I'm proud that she's agreed to do that for us next.
All right. Well, that sounds great. All right. Dr. Rider, thank you so much for your for the several times you've been on this program. It's been absolutely fascinating. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
All right. And folks, thanks for watching. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new Hidden History.